the roar beneath marble seats. Hey guys, tonight we descend into the shadowy tunnels of Rome's Grand Colosseum, that famously iconic chunk of ancient architecture that's somehow both a ruin and a tourist magnet at the same time. You can almost hear the distant echo of sandals on stone as you step into the dim arches, where dust clings to your boots and the air smells like forgotten history and dry leather. It's not cold exactly, but there's a chill that seems to slip through time, brushing against your arms as if thousands of years of whispers are trailing behind you. This is no ordinary bedtime journey. You're about to get a front row seat to the hidden side of ancient Roman entertainment. But before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, comment below where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious which corner of the world you're dozing off in. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk through the Hypogeum, the underground maze where gladiators once waited their turn to die or dazzle. It's quiet now, save for the sound of your own breathing, but once, this place was chaos. Men sharpened blades, prayed in whispers, and maybe even bribed guards, all while lions paced in the shadows and wooden trapdoors creaked above them. The Colosseum, for all its grandeur, wasn't built for fair play. It was a giant machine of spectacle, blood, and manipulation. If you've ever assumed that gladiator matches were all about honor, skill, and evenly matched combat, think again. Much like modern reality TV, what looked spontaneous was often rehearsed, and what seemed fair was anything but. You wouldn't survive this world unless you were lucky, popular, or very, very good at faking death convincingly. Let's rewind the centuries. Imagine standing at the arena's edge as 50,000 spectators cheer from marble benches. Some nobles in white togas, some poor plebs squinting from the nosebleed section. But you're not in the crowd. You're beneath it all, inside the system. You walk past rusted pulleys and animal cages, past graffiti scrawled by bored gladiators who probably hoped to be remembered. Some drew crude images. Others wrote messages like, "Felix was here," or "Victory to Crixus." There's even evidence that some left love notes or jokes. Yes, even when facing death, Romans couldn't resist a punchline. One mainstream historical fact? The Colosseum really could be flooded for mock naval battles, complete with miniature warships. Sounds wild, right? But fringe historians still debate how exactly the Romans managed the plumbing. Some say it worked. Others claim the water battles happened in a different arena entirely. What's less debated is that gladiator fights were rarely fair. The crowd wasn't there to see balance, they were there to see a show. Gladiators were property, trained assets owned by wealthy men or even the emperor himself. That means the people organizing these matches had a financial interest in who lived and who didn't. If you think the owners were just shrugging and letting fate decide, you're giving ancient capitalism too much credit. The truth is, from matchups to armor to the very type of sand on the floor, yes, sand choice mattered, everything could be tweaked to favor a specific outcome. There's something haunting about the scale of it all. You pause in front of a reconstructed trapdoor. Imagine a tiger being hoisted up on a platform into the roaring daylight above, already confused and hungry. Then imagine a gladiator being sent out to fight it, not because it was noble but because the emperor wanted to distract from a political scandal or maybe just impress a foreign diplomat. The unfairness wasn't subtle, it was designed. For instance, not all gladiators were even given proper armor. Some were lightly clothed on purpose, their deaths turned into suspenseful theater. One particularly infamous practice? Sending in unarmed criminals labeled as gladiators to fight trained men. Guess who the crowd cheered for? Spoiler alert, it wasn't the guys with sticks. You take a breath and sit on a broken slab near the gate. Above you, where the arena once buzzed with tension, pigeons now flutter lazily. But the silence is deceptive. This place is loud with stories. Take the case of Emperor Commodus, one of Rome's most unhinged rulers. He fancied himself a gladiator and would descend into the arena to fight crippled opponents or animals already wounded. Fringe fact? He once killed an ostrich in front of the Senate, then stared down the senators holding the decapitated head as a not-so-subtle threat. Imagine being a senator watching your emperor cosplay as a warrior while you're expected to applaud. No pressure. Modern scholars still argue over the numbers. How many people died here? Were the fights always to the death? The scholarly debate continues. Some historians argue that most matches weren't fatal and that gladiators were expensive assets, so their owners tried to keep them alive. Others insist that death was a regular feature and the value came not from the fighter's longevity, but from the drama of the moment. The truth? Probably somewhere frustratingly in between. Like most things in history, you rise, brushing dust from your hands, and continue walking along the curved wall. There's a faded carving here, two stick figures, one holding a trident, the other a shield. Maybe it was drawn by a bored trainee, or maybe by someone who watched a friend fall. Either way, it's a reminder that these stories weren't just grand tales of Rome's might. They were lived by real people, many of whom had no choice in the matter. The audience may have come for blood, but those in the sand were tangled in something deeper: politics, survival, and theater. You step over a groove in the stone, likely worn smooth by years of marching feet, and find yourself facing the central lift, now long gone but once a key part of the spectacle. Think of it like a Roman version of a stage trap, launching beasts or men into the spotlight. A calculated surprise designed to provoke screams. The Romans weren't just building a fight, they were crafting drama, twisting every element to control the narrative. Even modern sports can't hold a candle to that level of orchestration. And you, sleepy listener, are just getting started. Not all gladiators were equal. As you step from the hypogeum back into the arena's underground corridors, the thick stone walls echo with the uneven clatter of long-ago sandals and chains, whispers of men who knew exactly how unfair the next hour of their life would be. You brush your fingers along the cool surface of a pillar marked by age and sweat, and you begin to understand that the world of gladiators wasn't built on fairness or even logic. It was a complex, tiered system where some fighters were practically celebrities and others were just breathing props. You wouldn't last long here unless luck, wealth, or divine intervention were in your favor. And even then you'd probably still end up with a broken nose and a spear to the gut. Because here's the thing, not all gladiators were created equal. Some walked into the arena with polished armor, cheering fans, and the quiet knowledge that their opponent was an amateur. Others were marched in like livestock, armed with little more than cloth, and set against trained killers to satisfy a crowd that had already picked their favorite. You pass what used to be a barracks door, hinges long rusted, and picture the daily grind behind it. Inside, gladiators trained in special schools called ludi, but these weren't noble institutions of honor and fairness. They were businesses like ancient fight clubs with branding and talent hierarchies. The best fighters got better food, custom armor, and personal fan letters. The rest? Well, they got whatever scraps were left over, both literally and figuratively. Mainstream history books will tell you that gladiators were divided into classes, each with a set role and weapon style. There were murmillos with their heavy armor and fish-crested helmets, secutors made to fight the net-wielding retiarii, and thraex, inspired by Thracian warriors with curved swords. This division made the fights feel like chess games with flesh and bone, but what they don't always emphasize is how those roles often determined survival chances. Being a murmillo, for instance, came with a decent helmet and large shield, more protection, more time to react. Meanwhile, the retiarius was basically wearing a towel and waving a fork. Fringe fact: some scholars believe that retiarii were mocked and seen as effeminate because they didn't wear helmets and relied on speed instead of brute strength. That wasn't just theater, it was a reflection of Roman social biases, weaponized on the sand, and the inequalities didn't end with armor. Many of the so-called matches were less about strategy and more about status. Wealthy citizens or nobles sentenced to fight weren't usually tossed into death matches. They were given choreographed sparring sessions with safety measures and sometimes even weapons that couldn't kill. Contrast that with prisoners of war, slaves, or criminals. Those poor souls were often tossed into the arena with minimal training and a one-way ticket to audience applause. You stand near a section of crumbled bleachers and imagine the seating hierarchy. The emperor and elite sat closest, shaded and pampered. Farther back, the plebeians shouted, cheered, and sometimes demanded blood. And way in the back, if you squinted hard enough, you'd spot the poor women craning their necks, forbidden from sitting with men, trying to see their favorite fighters bleed in style. The placement of those seats said it all. Class mattered, and that extended right into the sand. You pause beside a faded fresco on the wall, barely visible in the low light. It shows two gladiators mid-fight, one clearly dominating the other. But if you look closer, really squint, you'll notice that the loser's weapon is snapped, and his shield is tiny, almost comedic. Whether that was artistic exaggeration or subtle commentary we may never know, but one thing's for sure: not every fighter entered that arena with a fighting chance. In some cases, the weapons were sabotaged. There are rare but tantalizing references in historical records. Pliny the Elder mentions arena tools being manipulated, and some clay tablets from nearby regions hint at armor being intentionally weakened. It's not hard to imagine a backstage deal where a promoter says, "Make sure Gaius loses, but make it dramatic." This leads to a deeper scholarly debate. Were these fights meant to be sporting events or spectacles? Some historians argue that the Romans genuinely appreciated martial skill and wanted to see evenly matched duels that tested bravery and ability. Others believe that was just a smokescreen, and what the crowds really loved was spectacle. Clear winners, dramatic deaths, and the occasional twist ending. The likely truth, of course, lies somewhere annoyingly in the middle. Rome was a place of contradictions, philosophers and poisoners, poets and executioners. So yes, some matches may have been fair, but many were rigged with the precision of a stage play. As you walk deeper into the corridor, the light dims and your footsteps seem heavier, as though weighed down by the stories soaked into the stones. You think about the men who stood here, listening to the roar of the crowd as it filtered down from above, each one knowing that their fate may have already been decided by someone sipping wine in a marble chair. And worse still, some of them may have trained their entire lives, only to be matched against a lion instead of a man, because the crowd wanted something exotic that day. You stop beside a weathered wooden post, possibly a leftover beam from the time when wild animals were chained here before matches. It creaks softly, though there's no breeze. You imagine what it must have felt like to be tied to it, hearing the cage door creak open, the crowd screaming, and knowing you were just the opening act. And here's a final cheeky thought to carry with you. While these men were fighting for survival, some wealthy Romans bet fortunes on who'd win based solely on how handsome the gladiators looked that morning. Style over substance even then. The myth of the fair fight. The myth of the fair fight. You climb a short flight of stone steps, moving from the shadowy corridor into a brighter chamber just beneath where the arena stage once stood. The dust here is finer, more like powdered marble, and it clings to your boots like history that refuses to let go. You stand still for a moment, listening. If you close your eyes, you might swear you can hear muffled crowd noise, chants, drumbeats, even the sharp rhythm of metal striking metal. But what you're really hearing is imagination overlaid with memory, because this place was designed to stir exactly that reaction. The Colosseum wasn't just an arena, it was a theater, a giant stage where every fight, scream, and splash of blood served a narrative far more curated than spontaneous. The modern fantasy, boosted by movies, novels, and grainy documentaries, is that gladiators fought in balanced duels of skill, courage, and honor. Two evenly matched warriors enter, one survives. Cue the applause. But let's be honest, even your toaster gives better odds than most of these men ever had. The idea of the fair fight is a myth, a polished bronze illusion presented to the masses to keep them entertained, distracted, and emotionally invested in a deeply rigged game. And if that sounds familiar, well, some things haven't changed much in the last 2,000 years. Let's break down how this illusion worked. First, gladiators were divided into different fighting styles. Murmillo, Thrax, Secutor, Retiarius, not just for combat variety but to manipulate outcomes. The matchups weren't chosen at random. Organizers often paired fighters to achieve specific effects. A heavily armored Murmillo might face a quick-footed but lightly protected Retiarius. Sure, this made for exciting contrast, the slow tank versus the fast trickster, but it also allowed for behind-the-scenes engineering. If a particular fighter needed to win for political reasons, or had become a favorite of the crowd and thus too valuable to lose, then he might be matched against someone with a glaring disadvantage. Fringe records even hint at dry-run sparring sessions before big events, where results could be rehearsed or discussed in vague terms. Imagine stepping into a fight where your opponent already knows you've been assigned to lose. What do? Smile and take the fall, or try to rewrite the script and risk everything? The illusion was kept intact by the presence of referees. Yes, there were referees in the Roman arena. They carried batons and theoretically enforced rules about engagement distance, weapon use, and mercy. But in reality, these referees had about as much power as a decorative doormat. Their job was largely symbolic, just one more prop in the performance. If the emperor stood and gestured, thumbs down, no referee was going to whistle and say, "Wait, that wasn't regulation." Their presence gave the appearance of order, but the truth lay elsewhere, in whispered bribes, backstage politics, and the ever-watchful eye of the crowd. Because the Roman crowd wasn't passive. They were loud, opinionated, and terrifyingly influential. A fighter could be spared or condemned based entirely on the mood of 10,000 sunburned plebeians. That kind of volatility didn't lend itself to fair contests. There's one mainstream example that proves the illusion of fairness was just that, an illusion. Emperor Titus once staged a 100-day inaugural game when the Colosseum opened. That's not a typo, 100 straight days of blood sports. According to Roman sources, over 9,000 animals were killed, along with countless gladiators and criminals. These weren't carefully balanced fights. Many were massacres designed to impress visiting dignitaries or assert Rome's power to its own restless citizens. The message was simple: Rome is strong, its enemies are weak, and we'll decorate our arenas with their bones if necessary. But not every historian buys the scale of this event. Some fringe scholars argue the numbers were exaggerated for effect, pointing out that logistics alone make the 9,000 figure questionable. Others counter that the Romans excelled at both cruelty and organization, and if anyone could kill that many creatures with flair, it was them. Debate aside, one thing's clear: fairness was never the goal. Spectacle was. The idea of the gladiator as a noble warrior, stoically accepting death with honor, was cultivated after the fact. Ancient Roman poets and later medieval writers romanticized them as tragic heroes, men who died so others could cheer. But in truth, many were angry, terrified, or resigned. There are accounts of gladiators throwing matches to survive, of others killing themselves before a scheduled bout, and of some trying to stab organizers instead of fellow fighters. These stories didn't make it into the official scrolls, but they lingered in the oral histories, passed down by those who lived close to the sand. One especially quirky anecdote: a well-known retiarius named Carpophorus was so good at fighting animals that fans suspected he used magical nets. Magical nets. No one asked why he always got tired lions or poorly armed opponents, they just assumed wizardry. Because even in ancient Rome, fans loved a conspiracy theory. You move slowly now, tracing the curved wall of the arena itself. This is where the illusion was strongest. From the stands, a fight might look even tense, thrilling. But from down here, beneath the stones and spotlights, you can see how things were slanted. Some fighters were given better weapons. Others were instructed to fight cautiously, a coded term for lose convincingly. The emperor might want drama, not a massacre, or vice versa. Audience reactions shaped everything. Did the crowd boo too early? Maybe the match was extended. Did they chant a fighter's name? Maybe his opponent suddenly slipped. Modern sports have referees, replays, and governing bodies. Rome had wine-fueled mobs and a sovereign who could rewrite the rules mid-match. That's not competition. That's performance art with body counts. And yet, many Romans believed in the myth. They genuinely thought the games were proof of courage and Roman superiority. This wasn't just entertainment, it was propaganda fed in daily doses to a hungry public. Gladiator games reassured people that Rome was in control, that chaos could be tamed, and that the empire's enemies, real or imagined, would always fall to a well-timed sword thrust. That belief system depended on the myth of fairness. If people believed the fights were honest, then the outcomes felt righteous. If they suspected rigging, the whole system trembled. That's why so much effort went into costumes, stage effects, and storytelling. Fighters had roles, rivalries, and sometimes even merchandise. Yes, merchandise. Some popular gladiators had oil flasks, figurines, and even painted mugs sold with their likeness. Think of it as ancient Rome's version of fan culture, just with more blood and fewer podcast interviews. Before you leave this section of the arena, you pause at a rectangular slab in the floor. It's where fallen gladiators were dragged before being hauled out by the cleanup crew. Yes, Rome had a janitorial team for corpse removal. Think about that for a second. A fight ends, the crowd cheers or groans, and within minutes, slaves are rushing out with hooks and sandbags to erase the evidence. The next match begins, fresh and gleaming as if nothing happened. The illusion resets and the myth marches on. And somewhere in the crowd, a new generation watches. Class and cruelty in the arena. You duck beneath a low arch as the path narrows, the ceiling suddenly dropping just enough to make you instinctively hunch. Your hand brushes the chisel-gouged grooves along the wall, worn deep from years of heavy carts and hurried feet dragging shields and spears across the stone. You're not just walking through the architecture of a stadium, you're moving through the veins of a brutal social machine that operated on inequality as naturally as it did on sand and blood. In the dim light, you start to grasp something essential to Rome's gladiatorial world. Class wasn't just a backdrop to the violence, it was the very structure that shaped who got to swing a sword and who got to bleed for applause. As you move deeper, it becomes clear, who you were before stepping into the Colosseum mattered almost as much as what you could do once you got there. The Roman games didn't merely entertain the masses, they reinforced the social order with every cheer, jeer, and beheading. Now imagine you're not just a spectator or a ghostly visitor. Imagine you're a captured Gaul, shipped in from the fringes of the empire, dragged through mud and shame, and sold to a gladiator school like livestock at a market. You're branded, given a cheap wooden sword, and told to fight in 3 weeks. No Roman name, no armor fitting, no real training. You'll probably end up in a warm-up match, designed to amuse the early crowd as they sip watered wine and find their seats. Your opponent? Likely another foreigner, possibly starved for drama, and armed with just enough weaponry to keep things chaotic. If you both die, no one will remember your names. If one of you lives, the crowd will cheer. Either way, your story ends there. Now contrast that with a disgraced Roman senator who's been sentenced to fight for treason. Sure, he'll wear a dramatic costume. The audience will love it. But odds are he'll be paired with someone toothless, perhaps a blindfolded prisoner or an animal that's already been wounded earlier in the day. The crowd still gets its thrills, but no risk is taken. This man will prove his redemption in a highly scripted duel, then be pardoned by the emperor in a grand gesture of mercy. He may even get a little fame from the whole ordeal. Why? Because his status, his lineage, and his political connections kept him wrapped in an invisible armor, far more effective than bronze or chainmail. You pause at a mural carved into the wall, now faded into pale shadows, but still showing the outlines of figures in combat. One wears elaborate armor with curling engravings and a feathered crest. The other looks practically naked, holding a broken trident. This isn't a portrait of heroism, it's a propaganda piece. Rome wasn't hiding the inequality, it was advertising it. Mainstream historical records often paint gladiators as heroes, or at least celebrities. And sure, some were men like Spartacus whose legacy turned into legend. But most fighters weren't folk heroes. They were tools, ranked, trained, and deployed like chess pieces in a bloody game designed to reinforce the power dynamics of Roman society. And the class divisions didn't stop at the arena floor. Seating within the Colosseum was rigidly stratified. The best seats, shaded, close to the action, padded, were reserved for senators and equestrians. Lower down sat the wealthy merchant class. Still lower, the plebeians, often standing room only. And at the very back, tucked behind columns and barely able to see, sat the women. Not because they weren't interested, they were passionately so, but because they were legally prohibited from sitting among men. Fringe detail? Some women became so obsessed with particular gladiators that they left love notes carved into walls, commissioned graffiti, or even paid to sneak into the training schools. One piece of ancient graffiti reads, "Crescens, the netman, holds the hearts of all the girls." It's the Roman equivalent of Team Edward, just with more tridents. Now here's where it gets sneakier. The actual matchups were also influenced by class-based pressure. Owners of gladiator schools or lanisti often had relationships with the rich. If a senator had a pet fighter, yes, that was a thing, then that fighter might conveniently avoid dangerous matches. And if a fight was scheduled that could humiliate someone important, well, maybe that fight got quietly cancelled or the opponent suddenly fell ill. Behind the polished image of organized combat, there was constant manipulation. The powerful didn't just watch the games, they shaped them. Some fringe historians even suggest that political messages were woven into matches, staging battles that symbolized Rome defeating a certain barbarian tribe, or setting up fights where a savage fighter was predictably conquered by a Roman hero. It was state-sponsored theater masquerading as sport. You step into a small room, more like an alcove really, off to the side of the main corridor. This was once a prep room for fighters, a place to oil muscles, strap on armor, and try not to think about the odds. You can still see grooves in the floor from pacing feet, and the corners hold darker stains, perhaps oil, perhaps something else. In this space there was no equality. One fighter might be rubbing Tiger Balm into fresh wounds from yesterday's match. Another might be sipping imported wine and having his armor polished by a servant. They wore the same helmets, fought in the same sand, but they lived in different worlds. And let's not forget that the Colosseum wasn't the only venue for this class-based cruelty. There were hundreds of smaller amphitheaters across the Roman Empire, from Gaul to North Africa to Syria. Local elites would sponsor games, often funding elaborate executions or stage sea battles, all to show off their wealth and loyalty to Rome. These events reinforced the idea that Rome was in charge and that even entertainment had a pecking order. Mainstream fact. In Pompeii, frescoes show detailed depictions of local games, including fights between gladiators who were clearly mismatched. These weren't mistakes. They were curated scenes, custom designed for maximum theatricality. Modern scholars still debate whether the average Roman citizen saw through the charade. Did they understand that these games were manipulated? That class and politics shaped every aspect? Some historians argue the crowd knew but didn't care. Others believe the myth of the fair fight was deeply believed by the masses. What's not debated is that the system benefited from the illusion. If people saw fighters as brave warriors, then the violence felt noble. If they saw losers as deserving, then the bloodshed felt justified. The deeper truth, that many died simply because they were poor, foreign, or unlucky, was easier to ignore when the show was good. You leave the prep room and follow a hallway back toward the sunlight. There's a shallow depression in the floor where water once drained, stained faintly red despite the centuries. You stare at it a moment too long, thinking not of glory or spectacle but of waste. How many lives were spent here to reinforce the idea that some people mattered more than others? That your armor, your name, or your seat in the arena determined whether you lived or became part of the scenery. Rome had many gods, but none as universally worshipped as status. And here, in the Colosseum, status wasn't just on display, it was the main event. How the emperor tilted the odds. You now find yourself moving through a side corridor that runs just beneath what used to be the emperor's private entrance. An elevated path flanked by statues, once gilded, now eyeless and weathered like forgotten chess pieces. The air here feels different, less heavy but more oppressive, like it carries the weight of every decision that changed a man's fate with a flick of a wrist. Above you, long ago, emperors once reclined on cushioned thrones, shielded from the sun by embroidered canopies, sipping cool wine from glass cups while deciding whether someone lived or died, often based on nothing more than mood, whim, or political theater. And the more you explore this space, the more you realize just how profoundly the emperor's presence distorted any sense of fairness the games might have had. Because in Rome, when it came to gladiatorial combat, the only real rule was, if the emperor wanted you dead, you died, and if he wanted to make a point, you'd be part of the punctuation. This wasn't incidental influence, it was baked into the system. The emperor didn't just attend the games, he owned many of the gladiators, funded the events, dictated match pairings, and even changed outcomes in real time. Some emperors, like Augustus, tried to maintain a veneer of restraint, pretending to listen to crowd opinion or deferring to referees. But others, like Commodus or Caligula, treated the arena like a personal puppet show. Fringe fact: Caligula once ordered an entire section of the audience thrown into the arena and mauled by beasts. Not because they committed a crime but because he got bored. When absolute power meets spectacle, things get creative and cruel. You pause at the archway where the emperor's viewing box once stood. A few fragments of marble remain, etched with stylized laurels and faded Latin inscriptions. From here, the emperor could see everything: the shimmering helmets, the silver glint of swords, the crimson bloom of fresh blood in sunlit sand. But more importantly, everyone could see him. His gestures weren't just private decisions, they were public performances, symbolic actions that echoed through every level of Roman society. Thumbs up, thumbs down? It wasn't as simple as Hollywood made it out to be. In fact, scholars still debate what gestures were actually used. One mainstream theory is that the so-called thumbs down didn't exist in the way we picture it today. Instead, the crowd and emperor might extend a closed fist with the thumb tucked inside for mercy, or thrust it outward, like a sword drawn from a scabbard, to demand death. The uncertainty isn't just a quirk, it's a clue that even then the spectacle was more important than the specifics. The emperor's role wasn't limited to approving kills. He often interfered before matches even began. Want a particular gladiator to win because he reminds you of your favorite poet? Done. Want a political rival's son to lose in front of a foreign ambassador? Consider it arranged. You pass a broken platform lift, once used to surprise the crowd by introducing last-minute opponents or exotic animals. But sometimes the surprise wasn't just for the audience, it was for the gladiators themselves. Fighters were occasionally told they'd be in a simple exhibition match, only to find themselves face-to-face with a fully armed champion, or worse, an enraged bull. You can almost hear the door slam shut behind them, the cheers rising, the emperor smiling just slightly, pleased with his own impromptu plot twist. Take the example of Emperor Commodus, possibly the most theatrical of them all. He didn't just tilt the odds, he jumped into the arena himself, dressed as Hercules, wielding a club and demanding everyone play along. He fought hundreds of matches, if you can call it that, and was never injured. Why? Because his opponents were either half-dead animals or paid to fall down at the right moment. Fringe detail? Commodus once killed a giraffe in front of a live audience, not because it was dangerous, but because no one had done it before and he thought it would be funny. The Colosseum under his reign became less a sports venue and more a sandbox for ego. He renamed Rome itself Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. You begin to grasp just how deeply intertwined narcissism, politics, and performance were in this place. But even emperors who weren't performing in the ring had their fingers in the arena. Claudius used the games to boost popularity, pardoning fighters mid-combat to win crowd approval. Trajan, often remembered as a good emperor, celebrated military victories with prolonged games that featured orchestrated mass executions of prisoners dressed as enemy soldiers. These weren't just random acts of violence, they were narrative devices. Rome had no Netflix, so the emperor gave the people binge-worthy blood sagas, complete with heroes, villains, plot twists, and climaxes. In doing so, he secured his image not just as ruler, but as curator of reality. And of course, not every imperial interference was dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, subtle. A match might be delayed so the emperor could arrive late for maximum entrance effect. Or a fighter who had recently angered the court might be assigned heavier armor and a faulty sword. The scholarly debate here centers on how systematized these interferences were. Some researchers argue that emperors like Domitian had formal bureaucracies within the games, with secretaries handling outcomes like state documents. Others think the process was looser, more gossip-based, influenced by wine-soaked parties, flattery, and casual cruelty. Either way, the end result was the same. The odds were never neutral, and the hand behind the curtain wore a laurel wreath. You find a small alcove beside the imperial box, probably once used by bodyguards or scribes. There are scratches in the wall here, letters and short phrases, likely graffiti. One reads, Numquam equum sub oculo Caesaris, never fair under Caesar's eye. Whether that was a bitter joke, a resigned truth, or a rebellious statement, we'll never know. But it tells you something essential. The people closest to the system knew it was rigged. The audience might cheer for justice, but the ones behind the curtain understood that justice bent like a reed in the imperial wind. And yet, despite all this, the illusion held. Crowds returned, tickets were sold, gladiators became folk heroes, and emperors basked in their orchestrated benevolence. The games endured because they weren't supposed to be fair, they were supposed to feel fair just long enough to keep the crowd watching. The real trick wasn't in how the fights were fixed. It was in how completely the public accepted the spectacle as reality. You pause at the doorway of the emperor's path, where the stones shine a little more than elsewhere, polished by centuries of imperial sandals. As you step away, the sunlight catches the dust in the air, and for just a second, it looks like gold, fleeting, dazzling, and entirely illusory. The gladiator economy, betting, bribes, and brand names. The sun now slants across the floor of a corridor lined with faded plaster and long-dead torches, and as you follow the curling path, you start to notice something odd. Scratched names, symbols, even numbers embedded into the stone and wood like Roman graffiti. It isn't the poetic sort left by love-struck fans or grieving friends. These are sharp, calculated marks, coded notations, odds ratios, even tiny ledgers. Because as brutal and theatrical as the gladiatorial games were, they were also a business. A giant, sand-covered economy that churned through coin, favors, secrets, and wagers faster than you can say, Ave Caesar. The Roman public may have come for the spectacle, but just beneath the roars and sandals was an intricate web of betting pools, commercial deals, bribes, and sponsorships that made the games less about glory and more about gold. And if you ever wondered why some fighters kept showing up even after losing multiple times, well, follow the money. You pause beside one of these etched walls and try to decipher what you're seeing. One list includes a name, Victorinus, followed by a series of numbers, 4:1, 2:1, and finally, 1:3. These weren't notes of admiration. They were betting odds, likely left by a savvy spectator or underground bookmaker tracking the changing fortunes of a fighter. Gladiatorial combat in Rome wasn't just sport, it was gambling theater. And people bet on everything: who would win, how long the match would last, which body part would be struck first, even whether the defeated would be spared. Bookmakers weren't officially sanctioned, of course, but they operated openly in the vomitoriums, the entryways to the arena seating. Some even carried tablets and wax pens, taking bets on credit, offering updated odds as each match played out. French historians believe that certain gladiators were given hand signals before or during matches to indicate whether they were meant to win or lose, depending on where the big money had landed. Sound like modern match fixing? Congratulations, you've just identified another Roman invention. But the betting economy wasn't the only financial stream flowing beneath the Colosseum. Gladiators, especially the popular ones, became walking brands. They were marketed with as much strategy as modern sports stars. Their images were painted on household oil lamps, carved onto cheap figurines, and even molded into terracotta cups. Mainstream historical fact? Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of such items, mass-produced and clearly designed to let ordinary Romans feel connected to their favorite fighter. You couldn't take a selfie with your hero, but you could pour your olive oil from a lamp shaped like his face. These products didn't just sell well, they were part of a larger financial ecosystem that helped Lanisti, gladiator school owners, earn extra coin, especially during lulls between events. And let's talk about the gladiator schools themselves. These weren't casual gyms or noble academies. They were for-profit operations, often owned by powerful families or business syndicates. A promising new recruit could be trained, branded, literally, and then loaned out to various games for a fee. The lanista collected the appearance money, covered the fighter's basic costs, and kept the rest. If the fighter won consistently, his value rose, and so did the stakes. Bribes became common. Bribe a match organizer to pair your man against an easier opponent, or pay a referee to look the other way when your fighter pulls an illegal move. This wasn't seen as shameful, it was business. And the higher the profile of the fighter, the more complicated the backroom deals became. One surviving contract shows that a lanista had to split profits with a local politician who helped secure lucrative arena bookings. Another outlines revenue shares from souvenir sales. You walk past what might have been a small accounting office, a stone niche with a bench and a faint carved abacus. Imagine someone sitting there, crunching numbers as blood hit the sand upstairs. Of course, not all fighters were equal in this economic web. The top-tier stars, those with names chanted by crowds and painted on walls, could negotiate better terms. Some even earned freedom and chose to stay in the game, becoming freelancers or training younger fighters for a cut of their earnings. Others faded fast either due to injury, age, or losing fan favor. And then there were the expendables, criminals, prisoners, foreigners who couldn't speak Latin. These men had no value beyond a single dramatic death. They weren't marketed. They weren't tracked by odds makers. They were cannon fodder designed to warm up the crowd. The Roman equivalent of an opening act that no one claps. 4.1 Especially quirky fringe anecdote tells of a fighter named Hermes Minor who became so popular that fans began shaving their beards in his style. His lanista reportedly sold jars of Hermes wax, a scented oil allegedly used by the fighter before each match. It probably smelled like disappointment and sandal leather, but the sales were enormous. Another school capitalized by spreading rumors that their star fighter had divine blood, specifically that he was a distant descendant of Mars. It wasn't true, but belief sells better than fact then as now. And when Hermes Minor eventually lost, badly, there were riots in the lower pleb sections. Why? Because the odds had favored him, bets were ruined, and fans felt personally betrayed. Welcome to the first known sports scandal in fan history. This brings us to a wider scholarly debate. Just how rigged were these economic underpinnings? Did the betting and merchandising truly influence fight outcomes? Or were these systems parallel and coincidental? Some historians argue that the games maintained integrity in the ring, and that the economic machinery simply orbited around the action. Others insist that the economy was the game, that everything from match pairings to referee gestures was orchestrated to support financial outcomes. And when you consider how much money changed hands, it's hard not to lean toward the latter. As you step back into the central corridor, you hear the creak of imaginary pulleys and the slap of sandals echoing from the past. You're walking not through a ruin, but through a machine that once generated wealth, stories, and illusions with terrifying efficiency. The Colosseum wasn't just a monument to blood, it was a stock exchange of pain, spectacle, and consumer loyalty. As much as people remember the violence, they often forget the math behind it. You stop for a moment near a wide arch labeled in ancient characters. This was once a sponsor's gate, a back entrance where wealthy families would enter and prepare to distribute gifts, host VIPs, or coordinate the day's theme. Yes, sometimes games had themes: punishment of traitors, victory over Carthage, or even bizarre ones like Beasts of Africa. These themes came with merchandise, songs, special concessions, and yes, souvenir tiles. One tile, found in Herculaneum, shows a man being eaten by a leopard under the words Panthera Parade. It's unclear whether it was a warning, a collectible, or both. So the next time someone tells you that Gladiator games were just about bravery and honor, you'll know better. They were about currency, literal and symbolic. Each swing of the sword, each drop of blood, each rise and fall of a fighter's reputation, was measured not just in crowd noise, but in coin, contracts, and influence. You brush your fingers along. Another series of betting marks, tiny scratches in stone, numbers now silent. But once they were shouted, bargained, and traded on like stock tips in a brutal arena economy where the house always won. Training for death, inside the gladiator schools. As you move through the southern arc of the hypogeum, the buried underbelly of the arena, your path curves again, this time toward the narrow passage that once led directly to the ludus, the gladiator school. The light is dim here and the air heavier, more stale. The stones under your feet grow more polished, not by design but by repetition. Thousands of men pacing, training, and fighting in preparation for spectacles that promised glory but delivered graves. The school wasn't a place of learning in the way you might picture today. It was more like a highly controlled prison meets gym, a brutal and exacting meat grinder where the human body was sharpened, sculpted, broken, and then rebuilt not for a diploma but for cheers and coin. You pass what remains of a drainage channel and realize, as the faint smell of rust and dust clings to your nose, that it once carried more than rainwater. Gladiator training was a full-time occupation. Once you were enrolled in a ludus, whether voluntarily or through coercion, you became property, owned, tracked, and optimized. These schools were run by lanisti who acted as both managers and wardens. Their job wasn't just to train fighters, it was to produce profitable outcomes. Your worth was measured by how many matches you could survive, how dramatically you could die, or how marketable your image became. The top schools, like the Ludus Magnus in Rome directly adjacent to the Colosseum, were sprawling compounds with dormitories, practice yards, armories, kitchens, and even infirmaries. Think of it as an elite athletic academy, except your scholarship was shackles and your graduation ceremony was a fight to the death. You step into a reconstructed training room, roof partially intact, shadows long and strange. The centerpiece is a wooden palus, a tall post used for solo practice. Fighters would strike it with wooden weapons again and again, sometimes for hours, developing muscle memory, endurance, and discipline. The repetition was relentless, but it wasn't random. Each gladiator was trained according to their assigned type. A Murmillo drilled heavy shield blocks and short forward lunges. A Retiarius, with his net and trident, practiced wide sweeps and footwork patterns that looked almost like dance. Mainstream historical records detail how these schools developed entire playbooks of move combinations, counterattacks, and stage-worthy flourishes. It wasn't just about winning, it was about looking good while doing it. Quirky fringe detail, gladiators trained with weights attached to their limbs, not just for strength but to force precise movement under resistance. Once the weights were removed, their strikes seemed faster and more theatrical to the crowd. Ancient Roman texts describe how trainers would even punish ungraceful movement, not because it was ineffective, but because it broke the illusion. The goal wasn't just to kill, it was to kill with flair. You had to be dramatic, visible, and memorable. The audience couldn't appreciate your tactics if they couldn't follow your movements. And the emperor, seated above, wouldn't pardon a man who looked clumsy, even if he fought bravely. The rules were strict. Discipline was enforced with beatings, food restrictions, solitary confinement, and sometimes even forced sparring with multiple opponents. Gladiators were often isolated from the outside world, not just for security, but to prevent escape, sabotage, or emotional distractions. Letters were monitored, visitors were rare, and escape attempts were punished publicly. One surviving account tells of a fighter who tried to bribe a guard to let him flee. The guard agreed, then turned him in and collected a double reward for loyalty. The escapee was executed in the next game, unarmed, dressed in a fool's cap, and mocked by clowns before a lion finished the job. That wasn't just punishment, it was a message. Yet, for all the brutality, the schools weren't disorganized. On the contrary, they were shockingly efficient. Each school had ranks, novitiae newcomers, veterani experienced fighters, and doctors trainers. Each day followed a schedule: warm-ups at dawn, weapons drills mid-morning, sparring before lunch, conditioning in the afternoon, and lectures or tactical discussions in the evening. Yes, lectures. Fighters were taught not just to fight but to analyze. They studied anatomy, strategy, and sometimes even previous matches, like football players watching game tape. There are records of wooden tokens used to replay famous bouts, almost like ancient play-by-plays. Gladiators knew their craft deeply because ignorance got you killed fast. You walked through what was once a small amphitheater inside the ludus, used for practice. Matches. The sand is thinner here, less stained, but still eerily silent. This is where they tested each other, shouted challenges, honed their stage personas. Because that was the other half of training: performance. Each fighter developed a style, sometimes even a backstory. Were you the silent thunder? The Celtic ghost? The sword of Libya? The crowd needed something to latch onto, an identity they could love, hate, or mourn. These personas were curated and adjusted over time, often by the lanista, who functioned like a modern sports agent. If you looked good in bronze, you got extra parades. If you bled dramatically, your poster sold better. If you had a catchy war cry, it was repeated in taverns for weeks. But perhaps the most overlooked part of gladiator training was the camaraderie. These men lived, trained, and died together. They slept in tight quarters, shared meals, stitched each other's wounds, and buried each other's secrets. A curious historical twist: despite being rivals in the arena, many gladiators formed strong bonds with their fellow fighters. Archaeologists have found burial sites shared by multiple fighters from the same ludus, complete with inscriptions like "He was brave and kind. I will miss his laugh." Some even mention shared jokes or training mishaps. Behind the staged rivalries were friendships forged under fire, quiet alliances of men who knew that tomorrow they might be asked to kill each other. This dynamic led to one of the most debated aspects of gladiatorial culture. Were matches between friends staged differently? Did they pull punches? Did they secretly agree on who would fall and who would rise? Some mainstream scholars say no, the risk of being caught and punished was too great. But fringe theories suggest that certain lanisti allowed choreographed matches, especially if both fighters were popular and the match outcome could be spun as epic rather than final. After all, two stars are more profitable alive than dead. One match between two famous fighters, Astyanax and Tigris, was reportedly so evenly matched and intense that the crowd demanded both be spared. Their embrace afterward became legendary, and both men saw their fame double overnight. Coincidence? Or choreography? The truth, as always, is smeared somewhere in the sand. You step out of the training yard and into the long corridor leading back toward the Colosseum's main tunnel. The mood shifts again. It's colder here. This is the passage fighters walk just before matches, the last walk. Walls here are carved with names, prayers, curses, and symbols. Some are etched deep, angry, and chaotic. Others are small and neat like diary entries. One reads, "If I die today, let them cheer loudly." Another, "I will strike left, then up. Watch me." These aren't just messages. They're echoes. This was the place where years of training became minutes of chaos. Where discipline met destiny. Where every routine, every drilled movement, every bruise and scar had to culminate in something unforgettable. And as you reach the final arch that leads back into the shadow of the Colosseum proper, you finally understand the full cost of this world. The ludus wasn't a school. It was a crucible, designed to strip away fear, doubt, and identity, and forge something both beautiful and horrifying in its place. A machine of flesh that moved according to choreography and cruelty. The sand ahead isn't just an arena, it's a stage for human drama so stylized that it could only have been conceived by an empire both obsessed with control and terrified of losing it. The role of women, fans, fighters, and scandals. As you curve around the Colosseum's upper corridor, where wind slips through tall archways and scatters fine grains of dust across cracked marble tiles, you begin to notice traces of an unexpected presence. On the walls, you spot faint engravings, hearts, initials, delicate etchings of helmeted figures, and poetic phrases in Latin that don't speak of conquest or power, but of longing. One phrase reads, "Crescens, netman of the fourth gate, take my heart as you took his spear." And beside it, a crude drawing of a man with a trident and strong jaw. You pause, the significance clicking into place. These aren't the markings of generals or aristocrats. They're the whispers of women, wives, daughters, lovers, and admirers who were not only present at the games, but deeply emotionally invested in them. Gladiator games, for all their masculine brutality, had a curiously magnetic appeal for Roman women, and their participation in this world was far more complex and scandalous than many people realized. Let's start with the obvious. In Rome's rigidly stratified society, women were often expected to be modest, quiet, and invisible in political and public affairs. But not at the games. While their seating was often relegated to upper sections, far from the emperor and senators, Roman women showed up in droves. They brought food, wore fan gear, yes, fan gear, tunics dyed in their favorite gladiators' colors, and shouted louder than many of the men. Historical texts from authors like Juvenal and Martial mock these women, calling them hysterical, obsessed, and lacking proper feminine decorum. But if you read between the lines, what emerges is a vibrant culture of female fandom, passionate, fearless, and sometimes rebellious. One mainstream fact that confirms this: archaeologists have discovered multiple household items, cups, lamps, even hairpins, engraved with names of popular gladiators, clearly made for female customers. But being a fan wasn't the limit of women's interaction with this bloody world. Some, especially from wealthier backgrounds, became romantically involved with gladiators. These relationships weren't just tabloid-worthy, they were dangerous. Gladiators, by law, were considered infamous, a legal status just above slaves. They couldn't marry citizens, couldn't testify in court, and were officially at the bottom of Roman respectability. So when an elite Roman woman was caught sneaking into a ludus at night, or worse, found pregnant by a fighter, it sparked scandal across the city. Fringe anecdote: a senator's wife named Faustina was allegedly so obsessed with a gladiator that when he died, she refused food and sleep, eventually throwing herself into his funeral pyre. While likely exaggerated, the tale shows how strongly these stories resonated, and how the emotional pull of the arena extended far beyond its sand-covered floor. But here's the twist, the one that historians often leave buried beneath layers of marble and moral judgment. Some women didn't just admire gladiators. They became them. Female gladiators, called gladiatrices, were rare, controversial, and deeply fascinating. Their existence is debated by scholars, but mainstream evidence confirms they were real. In 200 AD, Emperor Septimius Severus explicitly banned female participation in the games, suggesting it had been happening enough to cause concern. One surviving marble relief shows two women, named Amazon and Achillea, dressed in gladiatorial gear in mid-combat. The inscription describes them as fought bravely and with honor. But what was it like to be a female fighter in this overwhelmingly male-dominated spectacle? The sources are scarce, but the possibilities are rich. These women were likely drawn from the same social categories as male gladiators: slaves, prisoners, or thrill-seeking volunteers. They trained under the same brutal conditions, wore similar armor, though often stylized, and fought in smaller, more novelty matches, sometimes against each other, sometimes against dwarfs, and in especially cruel cases against animals. Their presence was both sensational and subversive. While many Romans saw them as immoral curiosities, others were captivated. After all, in a society where women had little control over their public image, stepping into the arena, even briefly, offered a strange kind of empowerment. You might be mocked, even killed, but for a short time the crowd was watching you, and the backlash? Oh, it was fierce. Roman writers tore into the idea of female fighters with venomous sarcasm. One poet described them as Amazonian beasts who wear greaves instead of modesty. Another called their fights a theater of shame. But you have to ask, if they were so shameful, why were their matches so well attended? Why were tickets sold, souvenirs made, and imperial edicts needed to stop them? The answer lies in that old Roman duality: publicly conservative, privately obsessed. Women in the arena represented both titillation and transgression, two things Rome could never resist. You now walk into what was once the gladiators' quarters, narrow stone rooms, each barely wide enough for a cot and a footlocker. In one corner, carved low and close to the floor, are the words, "Julia, may your blade be quicker than his." Whether it was a taunt, a blessing, or a fan's declaration, it's another reminder that women were present, involved, and unforgettable in this world. Perhaps not in the ways Rome wanted to remember, but in ways that echo louder now than they ever could have imagined. There's also the question of spectatorship. How did the presence of women in the audience change the tone of the games? Some historians argue that fights were made more theatrical, more eroticized, when women were present. Others say the opposite, that the crowd's cruelty increased as men performed more violently to assert dominance. Either way, their presence was catalytic. Fringe detail? Some gladiators deliberately adopted more romantic personas to gain female fans, perfuming their hair, using decorative armor, and even winking to the crowd. One fighter named Petronius the Handsome was famous not for his record, but for blowing kisses before every match. His losing streak was brutal, but his fan base was undying, literally. Two women were buried with pendants bearing his likeness, and one inscription reads, "I would follow him into the arena, even without a sword." And yet, women's roles extended beyond romance and spectacle. Wealthy widows sometimes sponsored games, using inherited fortunes to fund local contests. They did this both to gain political clout and to honor dead husbands who had once funded similar events. One woman, Vibia Sabina, funded 3 years' worth of arena games in Carthage, commissioning special animal fights and local champions to be honored. In letters and graffiti, she was praised as the mother of the arena and beloved by the people. For a society that claimed women had no political voice, the games provided a surprising loophole: fund violence and you earned respect. Modern scholars continue to debate the exact number and social impact of female gladiators. Were they true warriors or living props? Was their popularity genuine or manufactured? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. But what's clear is that women were not passive in this story. Whether cheering from the stands, whispering behind the barracks, sneaking through the city at night to meet a lover, or stepping into the sand themselves, they claimed space in the narrative, even if history tried to edit them out. And as you exit the upper corridor and descend a narrow staircase, the wind picks up again, bringing with it the scent of old stone, of dried herbs perhaps, of perfume lingering in a scarf dropped long ago. The Colosseum was never just a place for men. It was a stage for passion in all forms, romantic, violent, heroic, absurd. And among the echoes that fill these halls, some of the strongest are laced with sandalwood, determination, and scandalous laughter from the women who dared to cheer, or fight, for what they loved. The animal equation: beasts, blood, and public awe. As you make your way deeper into the lowest levels of the Colosseum, beneath the sun-scorched arena floor and the once bellowing roar of the crowd, the atmosphere becomes noticeably cooler. The walls here are thick, ancient, and worn smooth by time and effort. And suddenly you begin to hear it, not real sound of course, but the imagined echoes of growls, hooves, rustling straw, and chains clinking in tight corners. Because where you're walking now, this was never meant for human champions. This was the kingdom of the beast. Welcome to the animal pens of the Roman arena, where lions, leopards, bears, bulls, elephants, crocodiles, and even ostriches were once kept in dark, cramped misery, waiting to be lifted by platform mechanisms into a world of chaos, confusion, and near-certain death. The Roman fascination with animals wasn't just about power. It was about control, display, and spectacle. These creatures weren't just wild. They were props in an imperial performance meant to remind every Roman citizen that their empire, quite literally, tamed the world. You pass a grated tunnel, now long since rusted shut, and imagine what it must have been like to stand here in the dark, hearing the labored breath of a panther pacing in the shadows, or the deep, groaning rumble of a hippo far from its Nile home. These animals didn't arrive here by accident. They were part of a massive logistical operation, Rome's own living cargo network, that transported exotic beasts from every corner of the known world. Mainstream historians estimate that some games featured over 1,000 animals in a single day. That's not just impressive, it's logistically absurd. Caravans from Africa, ships from India, convoys from Gaul and Germania all fed into this system. The animals were captured, caged, marched, or shipped in boats across dangerous terrain, often dying en route, and then funneled into Rome like sacred offerings. Fringe scholars argue that the demand for animals caused temporary regional extinctions, with lions disappearing from parts of North Africa as Rome's appetite grew insatiable. But why such obsession with beasts? It wasn't just to watch lions eat people, though let's be honest, that was a major draw. The real reason was symbolic. Every animal in the Colosseum represented something Rome claimed to have conquered. A tiger? Victory over Parthia. An elephant? Triumph in Africa. A bear? The taming of the barbarian north. Each beast paraded into the arena was an avatar of imperial dominance. And when that beast was slaughtered, either by gladiator, hunter, or trap, it reinforced the message: Rome rules the earth. And the crowd ate it up like olives and flatbread. But here's where things get a little strange. Because not all animals were there to lose. Some were trained performers. Yes, actual animal acts. Elephants that bowed, lions that hugged their trainers, even monkeys that played musical instruments. These novelty moments were designed to break up the gore, amuse children, and add variety to the program. Fringe fact: one event featured a parrot trained to say, "Hail Caesar," before a fight. It was a crowd favorite until someone bet on whether it would say the line again, and it didn't, causing a mini riot in the pleb section. Even the animals weren't safe from Roman gambling fever. More commonly though, animals were part of the day's bloodletting. The venations, or wild beast hunts, were entire shows in themselves. Specially trained fighters called bestiarii would enter the arena with spears, nets, or small swords and engage the animals in deadly combat. Some bestiarii were respected professionals. Others were condemned prisoners, criminals, or political enemies forced to fight unarmed or half-naked. The audience didn't care much which, so long as something bled. Gladiators, by contrast, were expensive to train and maintain. Animals and criminals, though? Disposable entertainment. And it wasn't always one-on-one. Sometimes an elephant was pitted against a group of men. Sometimes a lion faced a bear. In one particularly disturbing event described by Cassius Dio, 100 leopards were released simultaneously into the arena. The crowd went wild. The floor was pure chaos. The handlers died first. Then the animals, enraged and confused, turned on each other. No victor. No meaning. Just noise, blood, and broken bones. But to the Roman mind, that was enough. Even the architecture supported this spectacle. You stop beside the remnants of an elevator shaft, one of the many that used a system of pulleys, ropes, and counterweights to suddenly release animals into the arena floor. Imagine it. A trapdoor opens, a lion emerges, hungry and blinking in the sunlight as the crowd gasps. Timing was everything. Some shows choreograph these moments like opera. Gladiator enters stage left, panther stage right, confrontation dead center. If it sounds theatrical, it was. The Romans called it spectaculum and they meant it literally. Yet despite the grandeur, not everyone approved. Some emperors criticized the overuse of animals in games. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, once wrote that the cruelty toward beasts reflected poorly on Roman virtue. Seneca argued that forcing animals to perform was barbarism disguised as culture. And Christian commentators, as their influence grew, found the whole thing repulsive, preferring martyr stories over lion stories. Still, Rome kept the beast shows running for centuries. Why? Because they worked. They thrilled crowds, distracted the masses, and made emperors look generous. One particularly bizarre spectacle involved trained ostriches pulling miniature chariots around the arena in a race. The chariots were decorated with banners of rival cities, and the audience cheered for their favorites. The winner? A bird named Spina, who was awarded a wreath of fig leaves and pecked at it proudly while the crowd roared. You can't make this up. Rome didn't just use animals for savagery, it used them for comedy, cuteness, and absurdity. You now enter a long, narrow hallway once used to clean and feed the animals. Iron rings hang from the ceiling, restraints for large creatures long rusted. Scratch marks line the walls. And at your feet, a small pile of white mosaic tiles, some shaped into claws, others into vines. Was it a mural? A warning? Or just decoration for an audience that liked a little flair with their fear? Even now, the scholarly debate continues. Were the animals symbolic, functional, or merely sensational? Did the Romans see them as trophies, metaphors, or just background noise? Some argue that the beast shows were moral theater, demonstrations of Roman courage, piety, and superiority. Others see them as crowd control, purebred in circuses. But perhaps the most accurate reading is also the simplest. Rome was a society obsessed with control. And nothing proves control like making a tiger jump through a hoop, or making a lion kneel before a man holding a stick. As you emerge from the animal corridors back toward the arena's edge, the air brightens and the echoes fade. But one image lingers. Imagine a packed stadium. Trumpets blaring. The emperor raises a hand. A platform rises. And from it, a confused, terrified animal steps into a nightmare it cannot comprehend. It snarls, it runs, it fights. And then, nothing. Silence. The sand drinks it all. And the crowd? They cheer, stretch, and ask what's next on the program. Audience psychology, why the Roman crowd loved blood. You finally climb the gentle slope that leads into the upper tier of the Colosseum. Once the nosebleed section, now a crumbling mosaic of stone, time, and ashes of laughter long forgotten. From this high perch, you pause, glance down into the hollowed arena floor below, and try to imagine it alive again. The roar of 50,000 voices rising like a tidal wave, the sweat and sunburns of summer afternoons, the smell of roasted meat, spilled wine, and damp tunics. This was the Roman crowd, an organism made up of thousands of individuals but behaving like a single creature driven by craving, spectacle, and strange morality. Tonight, as sleep starts to coil around your mind, we ask a very Roman question. Why did this society, so obsessed with law, order, architecture, and philosophy, find its purest joy in the sound of a blade meeting bone? The answer lies not just in the arena but in the hearts of those who filled it. First, let's establish what the crowd looked like. It was massive. The Colosseum held roughly 50,000 people, and every seat reflected your place in the Roman social pyramid. Senators sat closest to the arena, cushioned, shaded, and far from the beer spills. Above them, equestrians and officials. Then came regular Roman citizens, in rows growing steeper and narrower as you climbed. At the very top, women, slaves, foreigners, and the poor. They brought their own food, sat on hard stone, and still showed up early to get the best of the worst seats. And once the trumpet blew, everyone, regardless of class, became part of a single rhythmic heartbeat. So what drew them in? It wasn't just violence. That's too easy. Romans weren't bloodthirsty zombies. They were nuanced, emotional, and intelligent. They watched games the way we watch movies, for story, for tension, for escape. Each match was a miniature drama. The underdog, the traitor, the hero, the exotic villain from far-off lands. They weren't just watching fights. They were watching theater with real stakes. Mainstream Roman commentators often wrote about crowd reactions in poetic terms. One says, they cheered not for the kill but for the courage that welcomed death. Another, the people wept at a death well earned. That may sound high-minded, but it wasn't always so noble. Sometimes they just liked the chaos. The psychology of the Roman audience was layered. On the surface, it was all shouting, waving, and stomping. But dig deeper and you'll find a society trying to process its own fears, anxieties, and sense of power through what happened on that sand. Fringe theory. Some historians argue that Roman citizens who lived under tight imperial control used the games as emotional release valves. In their own lives they were powerless, ruled by senators, taxed to exhaustion and terrified of plague, fire, or war. But in the Colosseum they could judge. They could chant for mercy or scream for death. Their voices mattered. Their cheers or boos could sway an emperor's thumb. And in that moment they were gods. And then there was the element of ritual. Don't forget, Rome was a deeply religious society. The games often opened with prayers, offerings, and ceremonies. Some fights were dedicated to gods. Mars for battle, Nemesis for revenge, or Jupiter for justice. The audience wasn't just watching entertainment. They were participating in a cosmic drama. The death of a criminal wasn't just punishment, it was divine cleansing. The triumph of a gladiator wasn't just skill, it was fate made visible. The arena became a mirror for how Romans saw the universe. Brutal, ordered, and governed by divine favor. One quirky historical footnote? Some Romans brought personal charms to the games. Tiny carved figurines, protective amulets, even scrolls with lucky phrases. These were waved or kissed before a match, like fans praying for their favorite fighter. One account mentions a woman who tied a lock of her own hair into a bracelet for her preferred gladiator, believing it would protect him. When he died, she wore it still, for 20 years. But the most addictive part of the Colosseum wasn't the blood. It was the uncertainty. Every fight had a question. Who would win? Would mercy be granted? Would someone do something unthinkable? That constant tension, the suspense between life and death, acted like a drug. People kept coming back because they didn't know what they'd see. Some matches ended in surprising friendships, others in grotesque spectacles. A popular fighter might slip and fall. A condemned man might earn his life with a miraculous move. It was live, unfiltered reality, and every seat came with emotional whiplash. That there's also something oddly comforting about watching someone else face danger. It's a reminder, that's not me down there. That's him. I'm safe. I'm fed. I'm a spectator. In modern terms, it's like watching a horror movie while curled up in bed, heart racing, eyes wide, but knowing you're untouchable. The Roman audience leaned into that feeling. They drank, they laughed, they cried. They saw themselves in the fighters, and they also thanked the gods they weren't one of them. Still, not all reactions were predictable. Sometimes the crowd did something shocking. They refused to cheer. They turned their backs. In one case, they rioted because a match was too boring. In another, they demanded an encore death, literally shouting for a man who had survived to be dragged back and finished off properly. There were even recorded standing ovations for animals, yes, animals, that performed particularly impressively before being killed. One lion received applause so deafening that the emperor gifted its trainer a villa. You can't make this up. Scholars still debate whether the crowd's power was real or just an illusion granted by clever emperors. Was it a gift of control, or a trick to keep people feeling involved while decisions were already made? Either way, the audience believed it had power. And belief, as every showman knows, is everything. You lean against a broken column now, looking out across where thousands once stood. You imagine a man shouting advice to a fighter below. A mother holding her child up to see better. Friends making bets, strangers arguing over who would win. A sea of emotion pouring outward, filling the sky with ancient electricity. This wasn't just entertainment. It was communion. It was community. It was chaos wrapped in order, like Rome itself. And as the wind brushes past your shoulder, you wonder, were they monsters? Or just people drawn to light and shadow just like us? They had fears, hopes, favorites. They wept when a beloved fighter fell. They cheered when justice felt real. And sometimes they just wanted a good show. If that sounds familiar, it should. Because the Roman crowd, for all its cruelty and contradictions, wasn't so different from a packed stadium today. The clothes change. The weapons disappear. But the need, to feel, to judge, to be part of something larger, remains. Politics in the sand, gladiators, elections, and empire. The next corridor you step into carries a different kind of weight. Not the echo of swords or the scent of sweat, but the invisible heaviness of ambition. You're no longer in the realm of purely physical games. No, here, just beyond the emperor's box and beneath the flickering banners of noble families, you've arrived at the intersection of blood sport and political theater. Because in Rome, even the games were political. The Colosseum wasn't just a site for killing. It was a platform for control, image-making, and subtle empire-wide manipulation. From the moment you entered its gates, whether you were a citizen, a senator, or a slave, you were stepping into a stage-managed performance where every cheer could shift fortunes, and every splash of blood could become a tool for someone's power grab. Let's start with the most obvious: the emperor. Seated in the prime spot, center front, shaded by a canopy, attended by guards and scribes, the emperor was the beating heart of the spectacle. And he knew it. Every glance, every hand signal, every nod or grimace sent messages to the people. If he spared a defeated fighter, it was mercy. If he ordered death, it was justice. Either way, the crowd read into every decision. Mainstream Roman writers like Suetonius and Dio Cassius described these moments with breathless attention, noting how emperors practiced their gestures like seasoned actors. Fringe detail? Emperor Commodus. Yes, that Commodus actually performed in the arena himself, fighting as a gladiator, against wounded animals or opponents armed with wooden swords. He never lost, of course. But he charged the treasury enormous fees for every match, pretending he was a private contractor, not the emperor. Essentially, he paid himself from public funds to play warrior, and no one dared say no. But it wasn't just emperors using the games for image control. Ambitious senators, military generals, and local magistrates often sponsored events to gain favor with the public. You see, giving the people a good show was a fast track to popularity. In a society where direct campaigning was considered tacky or even illegal, sponsorship became the loophole. Provide the games. Impress the crowd. Let your name be shouted in the stands and whispered at market stalls. One successful show could make or break a career. This brings us to the concept of munera, the private games funded by wealthy citizens, often in honor of a dead relative or to celebrate a public achievement. While originally meant as solemn rites, munera evolved into dazzling events packed with music, exotic beasts, rare fighters, and flashy stage effects. Fringe anecdote? A man named Gnaeus Calpurnius gave such an elaborate show, importing camels, panthers, and even a chariot race inside the arena, that people referred to his dead father as the most fun corpse in Roman history. Dark, yes, but effective. Gnaeus got elected. Now consider the arena itself as a symbol. Its circular shape, its seating order, its monumental size, all of it reinforced Rome's view of the world. Power at the center. Order on the edges. Spectacle as unifying force. By gathering tens of thousands of people into one space, all facing the same direction, cheering for the same drama, the empire forged a temporary unity. It didn't matter if you were poor or rich, everyone's gaze was fixed on the sand. And in that shared focus, the emperor could feel secure. There's even a theory among modern scholars that gladiator games were used to test public mood. If the crowd cheered a pardon enthusiastically, the emperor knew he was popular. If they booed a command, trouble might be brewing. The Colosseum was like a pressure gauge, measuring the city's emotional weather. Gladiators themselves weren't oblivious to this political role. Many used it to their advantage. Some aligned with powerful patrons, accepting sponsorships and favors in exchange for performing at key events. Others became so beloved that their fan bases became small voting blocks. One famously popular fighter, Flamma, received 4 chances at freedom, and turned them all down, preferring the life of a fighter and the adoration it brought. His refusal was celebrated in political graffiti across the city. Flamma stays for Rome. Let Flamma stand for the people. Was it sincere loyalty, or a savvy play to keep his status and perks? Debate continues. Even the structure of the games reflected political agendas. During times of unrest, like food shortages or political conspiracies, the games grew bloodier and longer. Scholars note that emperors often increased the number of executions during such periods, especially of foreign prisoners or political dissenters. It wasn't subtle. Look, citizens. Your hunger may grow but your enemies die. And I, your emperor, provide justice and vengeance on the same plate. In this way, the Colosseum became a form of narrative control, shaping how the people felt about their own fears and frustrations. And let's not forget the subtle propaganda. Banners and signs placed around the arena often praised the emperor or the sponsor. Musicians played songs written in honor of certain families. Even the opening speeches, delivered by announcers or priests, would frame the day's events as a gift from the emperor to the people. One classic example: today we honor Mars and the great father of Rome who gives us peace through the sword. Catchy, ominous, and effective. But political games weren't limited to the elites. The crowd played its own part. Organized cheering sections, often funded by rival families or neighborhood factions, would try to sway outcomes. One group might chant for a fighter to be spared. Another might boo a senator they disliked. Scholars have compared it to modern football ultras, fierce, loyal, and sometimes hired muscle. The crowd wasn't just passive. It was weaponized, and it could be dangerous. During the reign of Emperor Nero, a botched gladiator match led to a full-on riot. The crowd, furious that a favorite had been killed by a suspected cheater, stormed the arena and set fire to several stands. The chaos took days to calm and dozens died. Rather than punish the rioters, Nero replaced the arena flooring and offered a new set of games to heal the city's heart. Translation: by their loyalty before the next election cycle. Sound familiar? You reach a shaded archway overlooking what would have been the emperor's private exit. Here, carved faintly into the wall, is a Latin phrase, panem et circenses. Bread and circuses. It was a criticism even in ancient times. The idea that Roman rulers pacified the people not with good governance, but with free food and violent fun. And yet, it worked. For centuries. The games outlived emperors, plagues, invasions, and revolutions. Because as long as the crowd could cheer, as long as the sand could soak up stories, the illusion of unity remained. And now, standing here centuries later, you feel the weight of that illusion. The Colosseum wasn't built just from stone, it was built from political calculation, carefully managed emotions, and the stunning, terrible beauty of distraction. The games didn't just entertain. They managed minds, shifted allegiances, and held together an empire built on contradictions. It was blood and pageantry. Violence and virtue. A scream of power masked as a public gift. And at its heart, always, the quiet hum of politics in the sand. Their fights were more than duels. They were plays with weapons as costumes. And what about armor? Helmet designs varied wildly, some with full-face masks that made the fighter look like a living statue, others with open visors to show off facial expressions. Armor was often deliberately mismatched between fighters. A heavily armored opponent might be slower but harder to hurt. A lightly armored one might be more agile but vulnerable. The point wasn't fairness. The point was balance. Enough disparity to make the fight interesting but not so much that it felt like a slaughter. Yet that line was often crossed. Especially during Nazi events when condemned prisoners were given laughably poor weapons, wooden sticks, broken shields, or nothing at all, and thrown into combat against trained fighters or wild beasts. These weren't fights. They were public executions with props. And the crowd still cheered that. Let's not forget the most intimate weapon of all, the dagger or pugio. Short, fast, and personal, it was used when all else failed. In rare cases, gladiators killed with it in last-ditch acts of survival. But more often, it was the weapon used by executioners or even fellow fighters to deliver the final blow to a wounded opponent lying on the ground. Some daggers were elaborately carved, gifted to popular fighters by sponsors or fans. One recovered from Pompeii has the inscription "Victory is better than freedom," etched into the blade. Let that sink in. Even the tools of death carried poetry. Weapons weren't chosen at random. They were carefully regulated by lanisti, the managers or trainers of gladiators, who understood both combat strategy and audience psychology. A fight that ended too fast disappointed the crowd. One that dragged on too long made people restless. So weapons were weighted, armor adjusted, and rules enforced to ensure just the right level of tension. Think of it as ancient fight choreography, except the stakes were real and failure meant death. And here's where it gets even murkier. Sometimes the weapons were rigged. There are accounts of blades being dulled to help a favorite survive, or armor reinforced with secret padding. On the flip side, some unpopular fighters were given brittle gear or poor quality shields. The crowd didn't always know, but when they suspected cheating, the uproar could shake the arena walls. One senator lost his position after being caught fixing matches to help his favorite fighter rise through the ranks. Public reaction? Riots, boycotts, and the graffiti equivalent of angry tweets, "Let steel speak, not silver," was carved on 10 different walls that week. Even the disposal of weapons had ritual. After a fight, gear was collected, cleaned, and sometimes displayed. In major festivals, weapons of fallen champions were paraded through the streets. One curious artifact found near the Colosseum is a bronze trident, dented and blood-stained, with a small plaque, "The last breath of Crixus swallowed here." Real or theatrical? No one can say. But that's the point. The line between performance and reality was always blurred. Now as you walk the long hollow corridor lined with faded frescoes of weapon-bearing warriors, you feel their echo. Each figure once held steel. Each movement was rehearsed, yet real. Every weapon mattered, not just in the hands of those who used them but in the eyes of those who watched. The clang of metal wasn't just a sound. It was a language. And in Rome, where silence was suspicion and noise was loyalty, that language spoke louder than any speech from a marble podium. Weapons of the arena. Steel, style, and strategy. As the sun arcs slowly over the crumbling bones of the Colosseum's walls, casting golden lines across the dust-covered corridors, your footsteps lead you into a quieter chamber just off the main corridor. Here the air is still, dry, and somehow reverent, as if these walls remember the weight of weapons once stored within them. You've entered the armamentarium, the arena's weapons depot, and tonight, this section is all about what those gladiators actually used to fight. Not just how they used it, but why each blade, net, or shield was chosen, what each item symbolized, and how every piece of steel on the sand was part of a delicate choreography of survival, spectacle, and skill. Because in the Roman arena, not all weapons were created equal, and not all were meant to give you a fair chance. Some were designed for elegance, others for desperation. And some? They were there just to make sure the crowd got their money's worth. Let's begin with the most iconic weapon of all, the short sword known as the gladius. Yes, the very name gladiator comes from this trusty blade. Roughly 18 to 24 inches long, double-edged, with a tapered point ideal for thrusting, the gladius was more than a tool, it was a signature. Roman legionaries used it to devastating effect in battle, but in the arena, it became a kind of shorthand for the classic gladiator archetype. Sleek, deadly, and efficient. Mainstream historians agree it was the most widely issued weapon among certain gladiator classes, particularly the secutor and murmillo, who fought heavily armored and relied on close combat. But here's the kicker. Many arena blades were blunted, not always but often enough to create drama. A dull sword meant longer fights, more sweat, more near misses, and more crowd involvement. And a sharpened one? That meant someone wasn't walking away. The balance between entertainment and execution was always being negotiated, sometimes in metal. Then there's the trident and net, the classic gear of the retiarius or net fighter. This gladiator class was among the most visually distinctive and controversial. Lightly armored, with no helmet, they wielded a weighted net to entangle their opponent, a three-pronged trident for stabbing and a small dagger as backup. Fringe detail. The trident was often barbed, not just for penetration but to make withdrawal of the weapon deliberately gruesome. The retiarius fought against heavier gladiators like the secutor, creating a stylistic mismatch that thrilled audiences. It was speed versus strength, fish versus fisherman, underdog versus tank. And guess what? This wasn't accidental. These pairings were designed like chess matches, each weapon's reach, weight, and symbolism pitted strategically to generate suspense. The audience didn't just cheer the man, they cheered the matchup point. One of the most unusual arena weapons? The scissor. Imagine a metal sleeve worn over the forearm with a cylindrical blade attached, sort of like an ancient version of a buzzsaw glove. The scissors who wielded this tool were rare but deadly. Their fighting style involved fast, aggressive lunges, aiming to hook or maim. The weapon looked terrifying, sounded even worse when scraped against a shield, and added shock value. It wasn't practical outside the arena, which made it pure showbiz, a weapon that existed only for Roman eyes to widen at the sound of flesh meeting spinning iron. Some fringe scholars argue that scissors were gladiators with prosthetic arms, the weapon doubling as function and spectacle, though the evidence is still debated. Either way, it tells us something important. The Romans didn't just love fighting, they loved creative fighting. Other classes had their own signature gear. The murmillo carried a large rectangular shield, scutum, a short sword, and wore a plumed helmet with a fish-shaped crest. The Thraex, or Thracian fighter, wielded a curved sword called a sicca and a smaller square shield. The hoplomachus mimicked Greek warriors with a spear and circular shield, while the Dimachurus wielded two swords at once, attacking with a dizzying blur of metal. Each of these setups wasn't just about lethality, it was about identity. A Thraex wasn't just fighting with a blade, he was symbolizing the barbaric Eastern enemy. A murmillo represented Roman order. Too much cruelty and you broke the fighter. Too much leniency and he turned sloppy. The ideal? A man who feared you just enough to obey, but admired you enough to push himself harder each day. One of the most fascinating details comes from a training manual fragment found in the ruins of Capua's Ludus. It includes not only fight moves, like the classic downward diagonal strike, the shield smash, or the leg sweep, but also emotional training. Fighters were taught when to grimace, when to scream, when to pause and raise their arms to the crowd. It wasn't just a fight, it was a performance. Each blow was meant to draw gasps, each dodge a cheer. Even death was choreographed. One section reads, "Should death approach, fall with pride. Let not the back touch sand." Because to die face down was cowardice. Face up? That was dignity. Let's not forget the role of matchmakers. Staff who arranged bouts, studied rival schools, chose matchups that were likely to excite but not bore. and who were deeply involved in manipulating public perception. These men tracked fighter records, injuries, grudges, and personalities. They built narratives: the foreign savage versus the local hero, the disgraced soldier seeking redemption, the apprentice challenging his master. Think of them as ancient PR managers with bloodier resumes. And then there were the psychological handlers. Not always official but often crucial, these were retired fighters, respected elders, or even sympathetic slaves who helped fighters cope with fear, trauma, and the constant threat of violent death. One former champion known only as Felix was said to walk the barracks at night, whispering encouragement to fighters as they shivered through insomnia. A fragment from graffiti simply says, "Felix gave me my courage back." The lanista often kept a tight book of bets and bribes, making or losing fortunes based on a single swing of a sword. Some became wealthy and influential, their names whispered in senatorial chambers or scrawled on the walls of wine bars by obsessed fans. Others died broke or mysteriously vanished after a bad match ruined a sponsor's mood. The position held power, but also great risk. Gladiators who survived long enough often transitioned into trainers themselves, forming a kind of fraternity of survivors who passed on their hard-won knowledge. Their rooms were slightly larger, their food slightly better, but their nightmares remained. One tomb inscription found outside Rome reads, "He trained 5, lost 2, kept 3 alive longer than expected. May his sword now sleep." It's the gentlest epitaph a man like that could hope for. And finally, the invisible army: cleaners, cooks, stable boys, armory assistants, animal handlers, hundreds of people who never stood in the sand but whose hands kept the show moving. A cook's mistake could weaken a fighter. A cleaner's delay could spoil an entrance. A blacksmith's dull blade could change a fight's outcome. These were the ghost workers of the Empire's greatest theater, and they rarely received recognition. But every cheer owed them a whisper of thanks. You now stand in a dusty training courtyard, weeds growing between the cracks of sun-baked tiles. A few worn footprints remain in the stone, deep grooves where heels dug in during endless sparring matches. The walls around you are scarred from blunt weapon strikes. A shattered wooden dummy leans crookedly against a pillar. And overhead, a faint breeze whistles through the empty rafters, as if still carrying the barked orders of long-dead lanisti urging their men to fight, to live, to perform. This was the engine room of Rome's most ruthless machine. And in these forgotten halls, where no applause was ever heard, the real work happened. Behind every hero in the arena stood a chain of hands, some cruel, some kind, all necessary. It wasn't just about glory. It was about gears, sweat, and the long, unseen grind that made sure the Colosseum never ran empty. Behind the scenes, the lives of gladiator trainers and staff. The blazing sun of ancient Rome doesn't shine down here. Instead, a dim, filtered light leaks through slats and cracks in the aged ceiling above you, illuminating a quieter part of the Colosseum's massive system. The section the public never saw but upon which the spectacle entirely depended. You've entered the backstage of blood sport, a maze of training yards, barracks, kitchens, infirmaries, and offices, where the real machinery of the gladiatorial world ticked constantly. And in this invisible world, it wasn't the fighters who ruled, it was the lanista, the manager, trainer, and sometimes tormentor of gladiators. If the Colosseum was a living beast that devoured men for the public's delight, then the lanisti were the careful, calculating hands that fattened the beast with discipline, strategy, and cold efficiency. Here in these training grounds, you can almost hear the snapping of wooden swords against wooden posts, the barked commands of drill masters, and the low groans of exhausted men trying to stay alive a little longer by getting a little better. And make no mistake, everything about these spaces was deliberate, designed not just to prepare gladiators for combat but to mold them into marketable stars, obedient soldiers of spectacle who would bleed not only with skill, but with flair. Let's meet the man in charge, the lanista. Mainstream Roman records describe him as a kind of hybrid between modern-day sports coach, prison warden, fight promoter, and businessman. He bought men, slaves, criminals, prisoners of war, or sometimes desperate volunteers, and turned them into fighters, branding them with the mark of the school, feeding them a controlled diet, training them relentlessly, and assigning them living quarters inside the ludus, the gladiator school. The most famous of these schools, the Ludus Magnus, was situated just a stone's throw from the Colosseum, connected by underground tunnels so fighters could walk from training mat to kill zone without ever touching the outside world. Life inside a ludus was strict, regimented, and incredibly calculated. Every movement was rehearsed. Every technique memorized. The men weren't just learning to survive, they were being sculpted into icons. Fringe scholars argue that many lanisti saw themselves as artists. One preserved letter from a trainer boasts, I do not train men, I craft moments. A kill is just a scratch without elegance. That's either haunting or brilliant, depending on how much sleep you've had. Of course, the Lanista didn't work alone. A full staff kept the Gladiator machine running. Doctors, known as medici, patched up wounds, drained infections, and sometimes stitched together warriors just enough to get them back in the sand. Some medici were skilled professionals. Others were barely more than butchers with herbs. One Roman satirist claimed that the only thing more dangerous than a wild boar in the arena was a cheap Colosseum doctor with a needle and 3 cups of wine. Then there were the dietitians. Yes, gladiators followed strict food regimens. Despite their depiction as shredded demigods, many actually carried a layer of fat deliberately. Why? Because fat protected organs from shallow wounds, made bleeding more dramatic, and extended a fight's visual impact. Their meals often consisted of barley, beans, and a mineral-rich drink made from charred bones or ashes, a kind of ancient protein shake nicknamed Gladiator gruel. Delicious. Every day inside the ludus followed a brutal rhythm. Wake at dawn, stretch and warm up, perform endless footwork drills, spar with wooden weapons, study crowd psychology, then eat, rest, and do it all again. There were no days off, no holidays, no room for error. Punishments for disobedience ranged from extra sparring hours to beatings, solitary confinement, or worse, denial of medical care after injury. Gladiators were property, but valuable property, and Lanisti walked a fine line between discipline and investment protection. The gladiator economy: fame, fortune, and freedom for sale. You step out from the hushed shadows of the gladiator training grounds into a breezier corridor, where sunlight pierces through arched windows to paint warm lines across dusty marble. This section of the Colosseum may not be part of the arena itself, but it crackles with an energy all its own. Here you're standing amid what we might call the gladiator economy, a rich and layered world of contracts, bribes, merchandise, and dreams of freedom that pulsed beneath the official fights. Tonight, as the weight of history settles gently onto your eyelids, you'll drift through a world where men were bought and sold, not just for their skill with a sword, but for their charisma, their popularity, and their earning potential. Because, make no mistake, gladiators weren't just fighters, they were brands. Endorsed, marketed, and exploited in ways that would make a modern sports agent blush. And in the chaotic heart of it all? Money. Let's start with a basic reality. Most gladiators were slaves. Bought by Lanisti from prison systems, war campaigns, or desperate families, these men had no say in their fate. They were property, and like livestock they came with price tags. A basic untrained recruit could cost a few thousand sesterces. A trained fighter with wins under his belt? 10 times that. A champion? Even more. And some were priceless, especially if they had public adoration. Mainstream Roman documents reveal elaborate contracts between gladiator schools and wealthy patrons. One record shows a senator paying the equivalent of 2 years' salary to borrow a popular fighter for a private party, just to have him stand silently near the table as a conversation piece. The gladiator didn't speak, didn't fight, didn't even smile. He was there to be seen, like a luxury handbag made of muscle and myth. But the economy wasn't just about buying fighters. It was about what they generated. Spectacle meant revenue, and revenue had many streams. Ticket sales, for one, were a surprisingly modern affair. Though the Colosseum offered free entry to Roman citizens for many events, especially state-sponsored ones, premium seats, like shade-covered areas, prime central rows, or private viewing boxes, were often available for a price or required bribes. Vendors sold food, drinks, and souvenirs. Yes, even in ancient Rome, you could buy commemorative tokens with your favorite gladiator's name or symbol. Clay cups, cheap rings, wax tablets, even action figure-style figurines carved from wood or ivory were sold outside the arena. Kids collected them. Adults traded them. Graffiti became fan mail. One particularly famous wall scrawl reads, "Celadus makes the girls sigh. He fights like Mars himself." This wasn't war. This was marketing. Then came sponsorships. Wealthy individuals or entire families would sometimes sponsor a gladiator's career, paying for better gear, safer matchups, or public promotion in return for reflected glory. A particularly handsome or skilled fighter might be given his own banner to be paraded before events. And in rare cases, a successful gladiator could appear in advertisements, not for products as we know them, but for public events or taverns that wanted to borrow a bit of stardust. Come drink at the Blue Lion, where Cassius the Slayer drinks after every win. It's unclear whether Cassius ever stepped foot in that tavern, but the line worked out. Of course, money also flowed in less official channels. Betting was rampant. Though technically frowned upon in polite society, the Roman elite bet constantly, on fights, fighters, even the number of wounds a man would take before falling. One popular game involved tossing wooden chips marked with predictions into a communal pot. Whoever came closest to the actual outcome took the winnings. Sometimes the Lanisti themselves would rig matches to ensure specific outcomes, working hand in hand with shady bookmakers. And when fighters were in on the fix, they had to act, taking dives, delaying strikes, bleeding on cue. Some became so good at faking it that they extended losing streaks just long enough to boost odds, then delivered a surprising victory when the payout peaked. Risky? Absolutely. But in the gladiator economy, everything was a gamble. Now here's where it gets fascinating. Some gladiators got paid. Not just in food and medical care, but in cold hard coin. Those who won consistently earned stipendia, appearance fees, or bonuses from grateful sponsors. A top-tier champion might make more in a single season than a Roman legionary did in 10 years. Some bought their freedom outright. Others saved to purchase property, slaves, or even, ironically, gladiators of their own. One famous case involves a fighter named Spiculus, so beloved by Emperor Nero that he was gifted a villa and estates. Spiculus retired with more wealth than the average nobleman. When Nero died, Roman citizens even asked Spiculus to avenge him, assuming he was both rich enough and brave enough to lead a rebellion. He declined, perhaps wisely. Freedom was always the most elusive currency in this world. A gladiator could earn his release in several ways, through manumission if purchased, as a gift from a sponsor or emperor, or by winning enough matches to qualify for a rudis, a wooden sword symbolizing retirement. The rudis ceremony was a big deal. Fighters who earned it were paraded, praised, and released with honor. Some wept. Others refused. Yes, refused. Multiple accounts describe fighters choosing to remain in the arena, even after earning freedom, because life outside felt dull, unstructured, or unsafe. And here they were legends. Out there? Just men. Fringe theory time. Some modern scholars believe that the Roman state encouraged this economy deliberately. By allowing certain gladiators to rise, earn, and even thrive, the empire created a strange illusion of mobility. Look, they could say, here is proof that even the lowest can rise if they're strong, loyal, and entertaining. It was Rome's answer to the dream of upward mobility, but bound in blood and applause. It kept the masses hopeful, the slaves obedient, and the audience believing in the system. But it wasn't all coins and clapping. Gladiators were often deeply in debt to their schools or patrons. Medical care, lodging, training, gear, it all came with strings. If a fighter broke his sword, that got billed. Got injured? More fees. A man could win 10 fights and still be considered in debt, forced to keep fighting just to pay off invisible ledgers. And that's not even touching on emotional debt, the trauma, the nightmares, the isolation. Fame didn't erase the scars. It just made people cheer louder while you bled. You now stroll through what was once a records chamber where financial ledgers and fighter registries were carefully kept. A few faded symbols still cling to the stone walls, names, tallies, crossed-out victories. Here, behind the roar of the crowd and the clang of steel, was the real empire. Numbers, bets, profits, losses, the business of blood. And as you pause beside a crumbling stone table, you wonder how many fortunes rose and fell in this room, how many lives were priced, bought, wagered, and sold. The Colosseum wasn't just a theater of war. It was an economic engine. And the gladiators? They were its currency, its product, and, occasionally, its richest players. Superstars of the sand, gladiators who became legends. As the marble beneath your feet grows smoother and the walls wider with engravings that glitter faintly in the torchlight, you step into what feels less like a hallway and more like a gallery of giants. Here, where statues once stood in rows and marble plaques immortalized names in bold Latin script, the arena's greatest warriors were remembered, not just for how they fought, but for how they captivated the heart of an empire. Tonight, you've wandered into the realm of fame itself, into a corridor dedicated not to emperors or philosophers or poets, but to those who bled artfully, who died dramatically, or, more rarely, who lived long enough to be carved into history's toughest spotlight. These were the gladiators who transcended anonymity, who stood out from the thousands of trained men that filtered through Rome's blood-soaked stages, and became names whispered by children, painted on tavern walls, and recorded by chroniclers and gossipers alike. You feel their presence even now. Not as ghosts of tragedy, but as echoes of fire. Because some gladiators weren't just fighters. They were celebrities. Let's begin with Flamma, whose story remains one of the most captivating mysteries in the gladiatorial record. Assyrian by origin, Flamma fought 34 matches, an astonishing number for an era when most men didn't survive 5, and won 21 of them. 9 ended in draws. But what truly defines Flamma is not his record, it's that he was offered his freedom 4 times. And every single time he refused. Mainstream historians have long debated his motives. Was it pride? Purpose? Stockholm Syndrome with swords? Some believe he had nowhere to go, no life to return to. Others say he loved the spotlight, the roars, the rush of steel. A fringe theory suggests that Flamma may have had romantic entanglements within the ludus, preferring the community of fighters to the loneliness of Roman streets. Whatever the truth, Flamma died a slave by choice. And yet, his tomb bears honors usually reserved for nobles, because in the arena he was royalty. Then there's Spiculus, Emperor Nero's favorite. Where Flamma was revered, Spiculus was adored, a warrior groomed, polished, and promoted like an imperial show dog. Nero gave him gold, land, even slaves, elevating him from the sand to the salon. Spiculus was said to have perfect form, balanced aggression, and an uncanny sense of showmanship. Crowds loved him. Ladies fawned over him. Even senators tolerated him. Nero once declared that Spiculus had the sword of Mars and the smile of Apollo. That's high praise, even from an emperor who eventually lost his grip on reality. Spiculus' fame was so great that when Nero's regime collapsed, he requested to die by Spiculus' hand, an honor Spiculus declined. Perhaps wisely. Another name etched in arena lore is Carpophorus, a bestiarius or animal fighter. Unlike gladiators who fought other men, Carpophorus specialized in combat with beasts, lions, leopards, bears, bulls, you name it. At one festival, he reportedly killed 20 wild animals in a single day. This made him a legend and also a symbol of Roman dominion over nature. Scholars argue whether he had special training or if the animals were drugged to dull their instincts. Fringe accounts claim he had a way with creatures, that he could calm a lion before delivering the fatal blow. One carving shows him mid-leap, dodging a panther while raising a trident. Whether fact or embellished fiction, Carpophorus was immortalized not just as a fighter, but as a force of nature. Of course, not all legends were beloved. Some were feared, even hated. Enter Commodus, yes, the emperor turned gladiator. While not technically part of the professional class, Commodus fought in over 1,000 matches, mostly against underarmed opponents or wild animals weakened beforehand. He fancied himself a demigod, renamed the months after himself, and charged the treasury enormous appearance fees. While his fights were rigged and his ego unmatched, his participation blurred the lines between emperor and entertainer. The public watched him with a mix of horror and awe. He didn't fight to win. He fought to remind them he could, whenever he pleased. And that was terrifying. On a lighter note, meet Priscus and Verus, 2 gladiators whose story survives in poetic form thanks to the writer Martial. They fought each other in a match so evenly balanced, so skillfully prolonged, that both men were declared victors by the Emperor Titus. Each was awarded the rudis and released on the spot, a rare double freedom. Martial's account reads like a love letter to their discipline and valor. Modern scholars even speculate, fringe though it may be, that they staged the draw deliberately as an act of solidarity. Whether true or not, their story is held up as the pinnacle of sportsmanship. 2 men trained to kill chose to honor each other instead. And Rome cheered. Then there's the story of Achillea, one of the rare documented female gladiators. While female participation in arena combat was discouraged and eventually banned, early empire events occasionally featured women in the sand. Achillea is said to have fought in armor styled after the mythical Achilles and often fought men. She won several matches before vanishing from the records. Some believe she died in combat. Others think she was removed from the public eye after gaining too much attention. But the fact remains, she stepped into a male-dominated world, beat its champions, and earned her place in the whispered legends of the arena. Even gladiators who didn't live long could become icons. Felix the Red, known for his flame-colored helmet plume, fought only 6 matches but was so theatrical in style, leaping, spinning, shouting insults mid-duel, that fans called him the Dancing Dagger. He died in his 7th fight, but his likeness appeared on mosaics and oil lamps for decades after. Children mimicked his moves in alleyways. One boy carved Felix Vivat, Felix Lives, into his desk at a school in Ostia. Sometimes legacy isn't about victory. It's about memory. So how did these fighters become famous in a world without TV, TikTok, or trading cards? Simple: word of mouth, art, graffiti, poetry, and repetition. Their names were shouted in markets, scratched into walls, painted on bedroom ceilings. Their faces appeared on cups, tiles, murals. And stories, true or twisted, spread like wildfire. One win turned into a legend. One dramatic death became myth. The arena made legends, but the audience sustained them. You now walk between the fragmented bases of statues long since carted away, their feet still etched into the stone like fossilized ghosts. Some are named. Others are anonymous. But each footprint belonged to a man, or woman, who turned combat into fame, who lived with the blade not just for survival but for legacy. The Colosseum was their crucible, but the audience was their wind. And as the distant murmur of imagined cheers fills your ears, you realize, in Rome, immortality didn't come from gods or emperors. It came from blood well spent, drama well performed, and a name shouted just a little louder than the rest. The medical mess, how gladiators were healed, hurried, and hacked back to life. As your sandals brush against a layer of finely settled dust inside the shaded corner of the Colosseum's subterranean vaults, you notice a curious silence, as if this particular space holds its breath perpetually, remembering the muffled groans and whispered prayers that once echoed off its damp stone walls. You've entered the unofficial infirmary of the arena, the domain of the ancient Roman Medici, where blood flowed nearly as freely as it did above the sands, but this time with a different goal. Not to end lives but to save them, or at the very least to patch them up enough to be thrown back in. Tonight, in this dim and often overlooked corner of the gladiator world, you'll lie back and drift slowly through the strange, chilling, sometimes surprisingly advanced world of ancient sports medicine, where surgeons stitched tendons while whispering curses, and where herbal pastes met crushed metals, and where no one ever quite knew if healing was a gift, a punishment, or just a delay before the next stab. Because make no mistake, medical care in the Roman arena wasn't about compassion. It was about investment maintenance. Let's start with what mainstream historians agree on. The gladiator schools employed full-time medical staff. These Medici weren't your average street quacks. Many had training either formal or experiential, and some even studied under the medical schools of places like Alexandria. They knew anatomy intimately, because they had no choice. When a man's chest is split open by a trident or his knee crushed beneath a shield, there's no time for poetic diagnosis. You act or he dies. And if he dies, that's money lost. So healing became a performance of its own. Surgical tools from that era reveal surprising sophistication. Scalpels, forceps, catheters, even devices for removing arrowheads or stitching abdominal wounds. Some of these tools would look at home in a modern operating room, until you remember they were used in torchlight, often without anesthesia, and frequently while someone screamed for their mother in Latin. But here's where things get weirder. Fringe archaeological studies have uncovered something unsettling. Many gladiators received standardized injuries. For instance, injuries to the left arm and right thigh were disproportionately common. Because right-handed opponents aimed for predictable targets, and these regions were often deliberately underarmored to encourage dramatic wounds. This gave medics plenty of practice with certain types of cuts, stabs, and fractures, and they got very good at fixing those specific things. One historian dubbed it assembly line medicine. They weren't healing humans, they were restoring products. A scraped tendon, a cracked rib, a punctured shoulder, all routine. But a head wound? A spinal injury? You were out of the system. Not because they didn't care, but because those things weren't worth fixing. An ancient Roman medical text recovered near Pompeii details common treatments. Honey to clean wounds, vinegar to disinfect, crushed garlic to prevent infection, and opium poppy to dull pain. Yes, they had primitive anesthesia. Opium, henbane, and wine were the trio of choice. A fighter might be sedated, cut open, sewn up, and brought back to the barracks in a semi-conscious haze. Others were treated with terrifying speed. One account mentions a fighter who was bandaged, stitched, given broth, and sent back into the arena the next day, still bleeding. It was never about full recovery. It was about optics. As long as the fighter could stand, hold a weapon, and grunt on cue, he was healthy. There was even a hierarchy to medical care. High-performing gladiators, fan favorites, rising stars, received the best treatment. Cleaner tools, stronger wine, more rest days. New recruits or condemned criminals. They were lucky to get leeches. A common complaint from surviving graffiti near the training grounds reads, "Broken but made to march." Dead men carried shields. Some fringe historians believe that losing fighters were sometimes denied care on purpose, especially if their death could save the school the cost of further upkeep. One chilling inscription simply says, "He limped, he lost, he lingered. He wasn't worth it." Let's not forget the role of healing rituals, which blended superstition with actual treatment. Wounds were sometimes prayed over by temple priests. Incantations were whispered during stitching. Certain herbs were believed to attract or repel pain spirits. One healing room discovered in a minor gladiator school included a painted mural of Aesculapius, the god of medicine, overseeing a battle while holding both a staff and a shield. It suggests that even in medicine the Romans saw combat as divine. Some healers claim to predict survival based on the sound of the wound. If the blood spurted too quickly, the soul had already begun to depart. Others relied on gut instinct. There are even recorded cases of fighters being rubbed with gladiator fat, scraped from dead bodies, believed to increase vitality. Whether this helped or not is debatable. Whether it was gross. Undeniably, not all injuries were physical. Mental trauma was widespread. Fighters shook in their sleep, screamed during training, froze at the sound of crowd roars. But there was no Latin word for PTSD, and certainly no treatment plan. If you broke down mentally, you were labeled spirit fractured, and given 3 options: prayer, punishment, or oblivion. One fringe theory suggests some trainers used music therapy, playing low drum rhythms or reed flutes to calm jittery veterans. Others say wine was the only medicine Rome truly trusted. The result? Men healed crookedly. Some got strong. Others just got silent. And then, of course, there were the healers themselves, unsung, overworked, and often deeply conflicted. One medicus, named Lucianus, left behind a rare diary fragment, recovered from a trash pit near the Colosseum. In it, he writes, "Today I saved a man so he could be killed tomorrow. I gave him breath and they took his ribs. I cleaned the wound and the sand welcomed him again. Is this healing or is this carpentry for coffins?" The entry ends with a wine stain. You get the sense that Lucianus didn't sleep well. And why would he? You now stand in the center of what was once a crude operating room. The stone slab before you is pockmarked with knife scratches. To your left, a rusted basin still clings to dried mineral stains. On the floor, in a crack between 2 stones, is something dark, charcoal perhaps, or a long-dried drop of something else. The air is thicker here, mustier, as if the echoes of groans still hover between the walls. This wasn't a place of comfort. It was a place of delay. A gladiator came here not to be saved but to be repackaged, to be cleaned, stitched, fed, and returned. The arena didn't allow time for healing. It demanded continuation. You didn't get better. You got bandaged. And if you didn't? You were replaced. So as you close your eyes tonight, wrapped in the quiet hum of whatever fan or breeze hums near your bedside, remember that in ancient Rome, even healing was a performance. The sand may have swallowed their names, but the doctors, the stitched flesh, the rebroken bones, they all played their part in a brutal machine that never truly stopped. The audience roared. The wound bled. The medic whispered. And the cycle began again. Crowd control, the roaring Roman audience and their strange demands. As you drift toward a new corridor of the Colosseum, the quiet hum of torchlight gives way to echoes, sharp, scattered, rhythmic, almost as if the walls themselves still remember the claps, gasps, and frenzied cries of thousands of ancient throats screaming in violent harmony. You're entering the emotional engine of the Roman games, the crowd. Because for all the blood spilled in the arena, none of it mattered without spectators. Gladiators were not just fighters, they were performers. And their fates, more often than not, were sealed not by the sword but by the shout. Tonight, as you settle deeper into your pillow and allow your breathing to sync with the imagined rise and fall of Roman applause, we'll explore the strange power wielded by ordinary citizens, how the people in the seats shaped the violence, manipulated its outcomes, and demanded stories that would satisfy their appetite for drama, irony, and beauty in brutality. So let your eyelids fall like the velvet canopy above the emperor's seat, and listen as the audience takes center stage. The Colosseum could seat an estimated 50,000 to 80,000 people. And they didn't just watch, they participated. Romans believed deeply in the theater of justice and spectacle. From the senators perched in prime marble seats to the laborers wedged into the nosebleeds, every viewer felt ownership over the action below. Seating was assigned by strict social hierarchy. Senators, equestrians, soldiers, common men, and finally women and slaves at the very top, their views often obstructed but their voices no less fierce. This physical stratification mirrored Rome's obsession with order, but inside the arena, those boundaries blurred. All could cheer. All could boo. And most importantly, all could vote, with their thumbs. Contrary to popular myth, the thumbs up means live, thumbs down means die rule isn't quite accurate. The gestures were more nuanced. Pollice verso, meaning with turned thumb, could signal death, but whether that meant up, down, or even hidden is still debated. Scholars argue endlessly about the exact hand signs used. One fringe theory even suggests spectators used cloth signals, white for mercy, red for death. What matters most is that the audience felt empowered. Gladiators played to that power. Fighters who understood crowd psychology had a better chance of surviving. A well-timed flourish, a dramatic stagger, or a fierce final charge, even in defeat, could win sympathy. Some would pause mid-fight to appeal to the audience, raising one hand in plea while blood dripped from the other. Others performed ritualized gestures of submission, offering their neck with theatrical solemnity. If the crowd was pleased, they might chant "Mit," let him go. If not, they screamed "Ugula," kill him. And the editor, the magistrate or emperor overseeing the games, almost always obeyed the majority. This wasn't justice. This was democracy soaked in adrenaline. Then came the chants. The crowd didn't just cheer, they choreographed sound. Popular fighters had nicknames: the Red Storm, the Leopard, Merciless Maximus, and fans sang them in unison. One fragment of preserved graffiti reads, "We chant his name, he brings the flame." Even more striking, audience members often brought instruments, small drums, bone flutes, even bells, to create a rhythmic backdrop for the fights. At particularly climactic moments, the entire Colosseum could feel like a concert. One foreign ambassador reportedly compared it to a thundercloud with lungs. But what the audience loved most was narrative. Fights weren't just pairings, they were stories. A disgraced soldier versus a tribal prisoner? That's revenge. A veteran facing a recruit? That's legacy. Two brothers forced to fight? That's tragedy. The arena was a live-action drama, and the crowd expected plot twists, betrayals, and poetic justice. If a man begged for mercy after cheating in a previous match, he was rarely spared. But if he had shown loyalty, bravery, or humor, redemption was possible. Romans were storytellers. And the bloodiest stage in the empire was where they saw their myths come alive. Of course, some spectators weren't satisfied with just yelling. They threw things. Rotten vegetables, coins, flowers, depending on their mood. One humorous account describes a fighter getting distracted mid-duel by a flying loaf of bread. Others tried to bribe guards or slip notes to Lanisti with requests. "Let my cousin fight the champion. Have the big guy lose in round 3. It wasn't always about fairness. It was about entertainment value. One popular fringe belief holds that some fans operated like modern superfans, collecting hair, dirt from favored fighters' sandals, even bits of old bandages like holy relics. Strange? Sure. But fandom rarely makes sense. And then there were the boo-worthy moments. A fight ended too quickly? Boo. One fighter ran away? Boo. Someone tripped over their own shield? Boo, then laughter. But the worst crime? Boredom. If the match dragged, if there was too much dodging, or if no one bled within the first few minutes, the crowd grew restless. In some cases, they even demanded both fighters be punished. This led to staged injuries, fighters intentionally nicking each other just to spill some blood and keep the crowd engaged. It was gruesome improvisation, a high-stakes game of "are they not entertained?" performed with swords. One of the strangest crowd traditions was the post-fight review, especially after major events. Groups of fans would gather in taverns and forums, reenacting fights, debating decisions, and even performing mock thumb votes with breadsticks. Early forms of sports journalism, scrolls recounting matches and rumors, circulated widely. One particularly catty scroll referred to a losing fighter as the flailing goose of Gate 9. That's either an insult or a weird culinary metaphor. Either way, the public had opinions and they weren't shy about sharing them. The emperor's presence added even more volatility. If he liked a fighter, the crowd often mirrored him. If he sneered, the fighter's fate darkened. But occasionally the audience pushed back. When Emperor Caligula ordered the death of a beloved Retiarius, net fighter, the crowd erupted, chanting "Mercy, mercy," so forcefully that the emperor relented, only to have the fighter executed privately later. It was a sobering reminder. The crowd's power was vast but not unlimited. Still, their collective voice could sway emperors, bankrupt Lanisti, and make or break careers. So where does this leave us? In a place where spectatorship wasn't passive, it was performative. The arena was a mirror, reflecting back the desires, fears, and fantasies of a population fed on conquest, pride, and pageantry. Gladiators fought with their lives. But the crowd? They fought with noise. And sometimes that noise was louder than steel. You now sit where a plebeian once sat, perhaps with olives in one hand, a child on his knee, and a bet in his pocket. The marble beneath you is worn smooth by centuries of fidgeting. In the distance, you imagine a cheer rising, not a single voice, but a wave, growing and cresting and crashing into the bones of the Colosseum like thunder on ancient stone. The crowd is still here, somewhere in the walls, humming their endless feedback loop of desire and judgment. And as you close your eyes, you realize, in ancient Rome, being seen wasn't enough. You had to perform. Because out there, in the shadows of the stands, the audience was always watching. The politics of the pit, how Rome used gladiators to keep the people quiet. You walk now beneath the sun-warmed arches of the outer promenade, where the breeze lifts dust and forgotten crumbs from the stone benches that once overflowed with olives, figs, and wild cheers. But here, far from the blood-soaked sand and the roar of the crowd, the real machinery of the Colosseum hums quietly in the background, a deeper, slower rhythm that never stopped pulsing. Tonight, you're stepping behind the curtain of imperial strategy, into the shadows where emperors and senators turned gladiators into distractions, where violence became a tool not just of spectacle but of control. This was no accidental theater. This was deliberate management of the masses, and every match was a thread in the empire's web of stability. So pull your blanket a little closer, and listen as we unravel how Rome kept its people fed, furious, and too distracted to notice what truly mattered. That you've probably heard the phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses. It's often quoted today with a smirk, a cynical shorthand for how governments distract citizens with food and entertainment. But in Rome it wasn't just a figure of speech. It was policy. Emperor Augustus institutionalized the practice during his reign, ensuring that public games, especially gladiatorial contests, became a guaranteed part of the Roman experience. Citizens received free grain, free seating, and an endless parade of shows, parades, naval battles, and of course arena combat. Why? Because when people are entertained, they don't rebel. When they're arguing over who should have won the match between Cassius and Titus, they're not storming the Senate. This wasn't generosity. It was pacification. Mainstream scholars agree that the games were subsidized not just by emperors, but by ambitious politicians looking to curry favor with voters. If you were running for office, you might sponsor a set of games out of your own pocket. The better the show, the more cheers you got. And if you gave the people a particularly juicy fight, say, a famous champion versus a condemned traitor, you could win lifelong loyalty. One senator reportedly spent a quarter of his estate's value on a 3-day festival, complete with over 100 fights, a mock sea battle, and a final duel between two brothers who had allegedly betrayed each other in war. True or staged? No one cared. The point was the drama, but the politics went deeper. Rome's rulers understood that the arena offered a controlled outlet for social frustration. When taxes rose, when food ran short, when military campaigns dragged on, the people grumbled. Rather than face riots, emperors flooded the schedule with games. Let them cheer instead of complain, one advisor wrote to Marcus Aurelius. And it worked, at least temporarily. The arena gave the public heroes to admire, villains to hate, and emotional stakes that distracted from daily hardship. Even executions, called damnatio ad bestias or being thrown to the beasts, were scheduled theatrically. A corrupt official might be sentenced to die in the arena not just as punishment, but as a lesson shown live and in full color, to thousands of eyes hungry for both justice and popcorn. Fringe historians argue that some of these punishments were engineered not for justice, but for ratings. One theory suggests that prisoners were sometimes deliberately framed or publicly disgraced to provide new matchups. Why did Lucius the scribe suddenly get sentenced to fight a lion? Well, he spoke out against the wrong magistrate last week. Coincidence? Maybe. But convenient? Always. And when the crowd roared, no one questioned the paperwork. The empire's machinery kept rolling, greased with sweat and showmanship. The games also served as a propaganda platform. Emperors often staged fights to commemorate military victories. Defeated enemies were sometimes forced to reenact their own losses, dressed in native armor, forced to lose, again in the arena. It was humiliation on a grand scale, meant to broadcast Roman dominance. Even the animals had meaning. Exotic beasts like tigers, elephants, and crocodiles were imported from conquered lands to demonstrate how far Rome's reach extended. One event celebrated the conquest of Dacia by featuring Dacian prisoners fighting against lions while Roman soldiers feasted in the stands. It wasn't just entertainment, it was a living map of Rome's victories. Audience participation, too, was political. By giving the people a voice, thumbs up or down, the empire created the illusion of control. It was performance democracy, a way for citizens to feel powerful without being dangerous. "We decide life or death," they cried, unaware that the matchups had already been rigged, the scripts loosely written, and the editor's final word guided by imperial whispers. The crowd believed they had influence, but the real game was happening in back rooms and banquet halls, where senators calculated which matches would distract from failing harvests or bad legislation. Let's not forget the impact on Rome's peripheral provinces. In smaller towns, traveling gladiator shows were used to reinforce loyalty. A regional governor might host a game after a rebellion, not just as a reward but as a reminder: Rome gives you bread. Rome gives you blood. Rome decides. These shows featured local criminals, conscripted fighters, and sometimes even imported champions, gladiators famous in Rome brought in to boost morale and broadcast imperial favor. It was like sending a celebrity to a disaster zone. The people cheered. The empire smiled. Interestingly, not everyone loved the games. Philosophers like Seneca and Epictetus criticized them as distractions from virtue. Christian writers denounced them as sinful spectacles. A few senators even tried to reduce their frequency, citing costs and moral decay. But they rarely succeeded. Every time an emperor hinted at fewer games, the public revolted. Even Marcus Aurelius, Rome's most thoughtful ruler, maintained the games reluctantly, knowing that the political cost of cancellation was higher than the price of lions and swords. One bizarre case involved a tax protest in which citizens demanded lower grain prices, or else they'd boo every fighter at the next festival. It worked. The governor caved. The next match featured a surprise hero, who wasn't even trained, just a well-fed volunteer in shiny armor. The crowd didn't care. They cheered anyway. Power had shifted, if only for a moment. You now pause beneath a carved plaque bearing the faint, chiseled names of a long-dead magistrate and the list of games he sponsored. Each line tells a silent story: 5 days of combat, 1 day of animal hunts, 2 days of executions. No names of fighters. Just numbers. Just costs. This wasn't a gift. This was a ledger. And the Colosseum? It was the biggest stage on which Rome's illusions played out. Spectacle as policy, blood as a political strategy, noise as a substitute for dissent. So tonight, as you sink into the quiet hum of your own space, your own private empire of blankets, pillows, and blinking lights, consider how easily the world can be pacified with bread and show. The Romans were masters of distraction. And as long as the crowd had something to cheer, they rarely noticed the chains tightening around them. Weapons of choice, tools of the trade for arena combat. As the corridor widens and you find yourself standing in a shadowy alcove where the faint outline of racks once stood, racks that clattered with steel and bronze, racks that shimmered with blades both brutal and beautiful, you're now standing in what would have been one of the most important backstage zones of the Roman games, the armory. It wasn't grand nor ornate, but it was sacred in its own right. This is where the fate of a gladiator could be sharpened, blunted, twisted, or tipped, where weapons were selected not just for efficiency, but for drama, flair, and crowd-pleasing chaos. Tonight, as your breathing slows and your mind begins to float between history and dreams, we'll walk through the clang and clatter of ancient steel, exploring the carefully curated toolkit of death used by gladiators, and how these implements were far more than mere weapons. They were characters in the grand narrative of the Colosseum. And not all of them were fair, or practical, or even entirely survivable. But they made for a great show. Gladiators were divided into distinct classes, each trained with specific weapons and armor, a system designed not only for variety but also to create a kind of ancient branding. You weren't just a fighter, you were a type. The most iconic of these was the Murmillo, heavily armored, wielding a short sword called a gladius and a tall, rectangular shield, scutum. His helmet had a broad crest, often designed to look like a fish, and his bulky armor made him a slow-moving tank. His traditional opponent? The nimble retiarius, armed with a net, rete, trident, facina, and a dagger. No shield. No helmet. Just agility and hope. Their fights were intentionally imbalanced, sword and shield versus net and fork. The crowd loved the drama and more often than not, bet on the underdog. The gladius, from which the word gladiator is derived, was short, about 18 to 24 inches long, but devastating. Designed for stabbing, not slashing, it could puncture armor with a well-aimed thrust. Some fringe scholars claim that certain gladii were weighted differently, customized for star fighters to match their balance and fighting style. Like a tennis racket or a cricket bat, each had its own feel. One particularly famous sword, nicknamed Red Whisper, was passed down through 3 generations of fighters at a training school in Capua. Allegedly, it hummed when swung. Real or just poetic rustle? Hard to say, but its name lives on in wall carvings. Then there was the secutor, often pitted against the retiarius. His smooth helmet, with only 2 small eye holes, was designed to prevent the net from catching, but it also made breathing difficult and peripheral vision nearly impossible. Some archaeologists believe this was intentional, to force the secutor into direct confrontation, to limit his ability to dodge or retreat. The arena didn't reward caution. It rewarded commitment. Another odd choice? The Thrax, a gladiator equipped with a curved sword called a sicca, perfect for hooking around shields, and a small, square shield that offered minimal protection. The result? Fast, aggressive fights with lots of movement and exposed flanks. Perfect for the front row. One of the strangest weapon sets belonged to the Dimacharius, who fought with 2 swords, one in each hand. They had no shield, minimal armor, and required an almost impossible level of coordination. But in skilled hands, they were a whirlwind of blades, spinning and slicing in arcs that dazzled audiences. Of course, this style wasn't exactly safe. Many Dimachari didn't survive their debut match. But those who did became legends. A fragment of graffiti near the forum reads, "He danced with death and gave her both hands." That could only mean one of them. Then there were the provocateurs who mimicked Roman soldiers, helmet, breastplate, shield, and short sword. Their matches were meant to resemble military training, making them favorites at festivals celebrating military victories. Their opponents? Usually each other. This was one of the few gladiator types that fought same versus same, creating a kind of mirror match. Scholars still debate whether this was due to training limits or an attempt at symmetry in the games. Whatever the reason, provocator fights were seen as pure skill bouts, more about technique than bloodshed. Well, sometimes. A particularly quirky historical detail? Many weapons were intentionally dulled, not to protect the fighters but to prolong the match. Sharp swords ended fights too quickly. Blunt ones caused more pain, more sweat, more gasping, and more drama. Some fighters even trained to snap blades mid-fight to generate theatrical tension. Oh no, his sword broke. What now? The crowd went wild. Of course, a backup dagger would be conveniently nearby. Totally spontaneous. Definitely not staged. Fringe theorists even suggest that certain match outcomes were choreographed like wrestling matches today, but with higher stakes and less spandex. Armor, too, played a crucial role. Gladiators rarely wore full-body protection. Instead, they showcased skin, both to display their strength and to increase vulnerability. A shoulder guard here, a greave there, but never too much. Helmets were often ornate, featuring feathers, crests, animal motifs. One Retiarius famously wore a sea serpent crest on his shoulder net, causing one senator to remark that even his gear swims. Another wore a bronze mask shaped like a lion's face. Visibility? Questionable. Theatrical impact? Maximum. And what about the weapons of punishment? Outside of the official pairings, the arena also featured damnatio ad bestias, in which criminals or condemned individuals were armed, if at all, with wooden swords or whips and set against wild animals. These matches weren't for sport. They were for message sending. Lions, bears, leopards, even elephants were used. Sometimes, fires or traps were added to increase spectacle. One condemned man was reportedly strapped to a spinning wheel as archers took shots at him from opposite ends. Whether this actually happened or is just grim poetic exaggeration, it illustrates how far Rome went for variety. So how did gladiators choose, or get assigned, their weapons? Training schools determined your type based on your body type, speed, temperament, and sometimes sheer need. Too many Murmillos this month? Congratulations, you're a Thrax now. Want to switch? Win your freedom and come back as a volunteer. It was like a role-playing game, except every level up could kill you. The most famous fighters sometimes got to pick their gear, even custom crafting it. Others were handed chipped blades and told, "Make it sing." You now stand before the ghost of a weapon rack. There's nothing here but the stone indentations where metal once gleamed, but if you close your eyes, you can almost hear the clash, blade on blade, blade on shield, blade on bone. The armory was where the story began. Not with names or destinies, but with choices made by trainers, politicians, and the cruel requirements of drama. Gladiators didn't just fight. They performed roles, wearing steel masks and wielding symbolic tools, each carefully chosen to balance the bloodshed with beauty, the pain with plot. And as your own thoughts begin to slow, drifting like torch smoke into the vaults of imagination, remember this. In the Roman arena, a sword was never just a sword. It was a script, a whisper, a wager. And sometimes, it was the only voice a man had left. Training day, how gladiators were molded into warriors and entertainers. As your steps echo along the packed dirt of an open courtyard that once roared with clashing wooden swords, guttural shouts, and barked commands in clipped Latin, you're now standing where gladiators were born, not in blood but in repetition. This was the training ground, the ludus, a place where terrified recruits, captured prisoners and hopeful volunteers were transformed through sweat, pain and muscle memory into weapons with legs. The Colosseum may have been the stage, but the schools were the script rehearsals. And tonight, you'll sink slowly into the rhythm of drills, punishments, and the awkward camaraderie of men whose lives depended on footwork, form, and a good dramatic death. So stretch your toes, soften your breathing, and let's step into the sand before the real sand. The rehearsal arena where bones were broken more often by accident than design, and where the cry of "again" echoed louder than any applause. Gladiator training began with classification. Upon arrival at the ludus, new fighters were inspected: physique, temperament, past injuries, reflexes. Then they were assigned to a type: Murmillo, Thrax, Retiarius, and so on. Each group trained in separate formations, with specific footwork, weapon handling, and routines. Mainstream historians agree that training schools functioned more like military boot camps than theatrical schools. Discipline was brutal but structured. Morning routines began before sunrise with running drills, sometimes in full armor, to build endurance. Diets were strict, mostly barley gruel, legumes, dried fruit, and the occasional meat scrap. Despite the reputation for being blood-soaked brutes, gladiators had what scholars now call a carb-heavy recovery diet. In fact, one fringe archaeological study found evidence that gladiators were called hordearii, barley men, because of their grain-based intake. It turns out that muscles grow on porridge and routine more than heroism. But training wasn't just physical. Gladiators had to learn stage presence. They were expected to fight bravely but also interestingly. Trainers, often retired fighters themselves, taught each student how to milk the crowd, when to pause, when to feint, how to fall convincingly, and how to make even a miss look majestic. A scholar once called gladiator training choreographed violence with a risk of real death, and that wasn't far off. Recruits practiced hundreds of times with wooden swords, rudis, and shields padded with straw. Only after months, sometimes a full year, would they be permitted to train with blunted metal. By then, muscle memory had taken over. Every block, step, parry, and lunge was drilled to the point of reflex. But that didn't guarantee survival. The next fight might still bring a veteran opponent who moved in a way they hadn't rehearsed. And then, the sand remembered point. One of the stranger elements of training involved persona development. A fighter was not just a name. He was a brand. Some were given fierce monikers: the Hammer, Leopard's Maw, Iron Wolf, while others were sculpted into anti-heroes or tragic figures. Fringe researchers believe that trainers sometimes assign narrative roles, especially in paired fights: the betrayer versus the loyalist, the savage versus the civilized, the silent mountain versus the agile storm. These weren't just archetypes, they were psychological tools. If the crowd saw a familiar role, they knew how to respond emotionally. If you could make them feel, you stood a better chance of making them cheer, and perhaps, of being spared. Punishments during training were severe but surgical. Late for drills? Whipped. Disobedient? Withheld food. Caught faking an injury? Public humiliation. But trainers were also careful. A good fighter was valuable property. They didn't want to break you, just bend you until you fit the mold. A rare surviving tablet from a gladiator school outlines specific disciplinary codes, including no food for 3 days for slouching in stance, and 5 lashes for failing to salute the trainer. But it also includes rewards: double portion of figs for best performer, 1 day rest for 5 straight training victories. It was carrot and stick, but mostly stick. The friendships forged in these schools were odd and often uneasy. You trained, ate, and slept beside men you might one day kill. Yet most gladiators formed tight bonds with their cellmates. They sparred by day, sang by firelight, and learned each other's weaknesses. One fringe belief is that some fighters intentionally threw early matches to preserve their comrades' careers. A graffiti in Pompeii reads, "He fell fast, but we knew why. Loyalty before glory." True or romanticized? Hard to say. But such inscriptions tell a story of men bound not just by survival, but by shared fate. Trainers, called doctors, were the masters of this domain. The head trainer, or doctor lanista, ruled like a miniature emperor. He decided who fought, who rested, who was ready, and who needed another month of spear drills. Some were strict but fair. Others were petty tyrants. One well-known doctor, named Aulus, reportedly made his fighters perform combat drills blindfolded in a pit filled with thorn bushes, not to prepare them for any specific enemy, but to toughen their instincts. Another favored psychological tricks: ordering a fake execution to see how recruits would react. Not everyone passed that test. Weapons and training were standardized but harsh. Wooden swords were often heavier than real ones to build strength. Shields were oversized, requiring exaggerated balance. This meant that when a fighter finally switched to real gear, they moved faster, felt lighter, and struck with surprising speed. One mainstream scholar compares it to running with weights, then suddenly being freed. The first real match, held inside a private training arena, not the Colosseum, was often the real test. It was called a prelucio, and it determined who advanced to the public stage. Interestingly, female gladiators, called gladiatrices, also trained in similar schools though in fewer numbers. Their weapons and styles mirrored their male counterparts, though they were often featured in novelty matches, female versus dwarf, female versus beast, or female versus female, and matches meant more to titillate than to test skill. Yet records show some gladiatrices gained fame and respect. One, known only as Achillea, allegedly won 9 matches and was offered freedom, which she declined, choosing instead to fight until age 34, a staggering feat. Historians still debate whether she was fact or legend. As you imagine the morning drills now, 50 men swinging in perfect rhythm, sand erupting under sandals, a chorus of grunts punctuated by the snap of wooden blades. You can almost feel the heat rising from the courtyard stones. Sweat, barked orders, and quiet desperation fill the air. This was no ordinary school. It was a factory. And its product wasn't knowledge or skill, it was survival instinct polished into performance. The arena came later. But it began here, in the repetition, the hunger, the bruises that taught you which angle would save your ribs, and which stance would earn applause. Now, as your breathing steadies and the imagined sound of sword drills fades into your own rhythm of rest, remember, gladiators weren't born in battle. They were made, painstakingly, brutally, efficiently. Every fall they practiced, every block they rehearsed, every moment they staggered under the weight of a wooden weapon. Each one was a step toward the arena.